Welcome to Victorian Britain, land of lace curtains, moral superiority, and laws that essentially said, if you're poor, please stop breathing so loudly, it's offensive, and if you ever felt judged for looking tired at the grocery store, congratulations. A Victorian constable would have already arrested you, lectured you about self-respect, and possibly accused you of plotting grand larceny, based entirely on your facial expression. Because in the 19th century, failing to look prosperous wasn't just unfortunate, it was borderline criminal. Let's begin with the dreaded umbrella term, vagrancy. Today, vagrant sounds like a slightly poetic word for a wanderer. In Victorian Britain, it was the legal equivalent of dangerous, suspicious, and probably planning something immoral. The Vagrancy Acts effectively turned poverty into a prosecutable offence. You didn't need to steal anything, break anything, or even do anything. Existing in an economically inconvenient way was quite enough. The official definition of vagrancy was wonderfully vague, which is always what you want in a legal system. Terms like wandering without visible means of subsistence or idle and disorderly persons. Translation: if your job didn't come with a uniform, a building, or a boss yelling at you publicly, the law treated you like a walking crime. Picture the scene. You woke up, stretched, realised you were hungry and dared to step outside in search of food. A constable saw you wandering without a top hat, noticed your boots had clearly seen better centuries, and immediately concluded, criminal mastermind. Never mind that you were simply trying to exist. To Victorians, poverty didn't just look suspicious, it was suspicious. A particularly delightful feature of vagrancy law was its obsession with visible means. As long as you looked like you had money, you were fine. The actual amount of money, irrelevant. You could be broke, starving, and one sneeze away from collapse, but if you wore a decent coat, society nodded approvingly and said, "Ah yes, a respectable gentleman suffering quietly as God intended." But if your coat was threadbare, suddenly the police materialised like moral judgmental ninjas. Even sitting on a doorstep could be interpreted as loitering with malicious intent. And imagine someone today sitting outside scrolling on their phone. Victorians would have assumed they were casing the joint, plotting arson, or possibly practising witchcraft. And don't think fatigue was a valid excuse. Looking tired suggested one thing: you had nowhere respectable to be, which in Victorian logic meant you were probably planning to rob someone who did have somewhere respectable to be. The laws also targeted habitual wandering, which essentially criminalised homelessness by calling it a hobby. You didn't choose to wander, your economic conditions forced you into constant movement. But to Victorian authorities, you were choosing to suspiciously drift about like a morally ambiguous cloud. It was a lose-lose situation. If you stayed in one place too long, you were loitering. If you moved around too much, you were wandering with intent. Basically, you had to walk at the exact speed of middle-class respectability or be arrested. And let's talk about nighttime. Walking after dark without a strong job, a strong chin and a strong sense of self-importance was practically an invitation to be detained. Many people working irregular hours or sleeping outdoors were arrested simply because lamps hadn't been invented for poor people. The moment darkness fell, so did the presumption of innocence. The worst part, these laws weren't designed to help the poor, they were designed to protect society from having to see the poor. Vagrancy wasn't about preventing crime, it was about preventing discomfort. If a wealthy passerby had to witness poverty, they might experience an emotion, and Victorians preferred their emotions stored neatly in labelled jars. Punishments ranged from fines, because nothing says stop being poor, like charging someone money, to hard labour, where you could break rocks while reflecting on your sinful crime of being alive without property. Repeat offenders were treated as hardened criminals, not unfortunate victims of the Industrial Revolution's chaos. Children weren't spared either. Many young orphans, street kids and chimney sweeps were rounded up as juvenile vagrants, accused of being future criminals purely because they existed without parental supervision. Victorian logic: you look like someone who might someday steal a loaf of bread. Better imprison you now before you think of it. Even skilled workers could fall victim. Travelling craftsmen, seasonal labourers, and job seekers often couldn't prove visible means on the spot. Imagine being asked to show your work resume to a grim-faced policeman while holding your bag of tools. One wrong answer, one moment of hesitation, and suddenly you are an idle person, a legal category that basically meant you paused to inhale and I didn't like it. To sum it up, the Vagrancy Acts ensured that poverty wasn't just a struggle, it was a criminal identity. The good news, if you survived Victorian poverty, you developed incredible resilience. The bad news, the police might still arrest you for having that resilient, suspicious look. If the previous part taught us that poverty was illegal in Victorian Britain, this part reveals the empire's next brilliant idea. You could also be arrested for the crime of thinking about stealing something, even if you weren't actually thinking about it. In the Victorian legal imagination, intent to steal was a magical phrase that could transform absolutely any normal action into a criminal plot worthy of Sherlock Holmes' darkest suspicions. The Victorians adored the concept of invisible crime. They believed that somewhere lurking behind every lamppost, under every bonnet, and inside every slightly too large coat was a criminal mastermind pretending to be a normal person. And they were certain that the only way to stop crime was to arrest people before they figured out what crime they wanted to commit. This wasn't law enforcement. This was pre-crime fan fiction. To begin, intent to steal was absurdly broad. It didn't require evidence. It didn't require stolen goods. It didn't even require that you be anywhere near something worth stealing. In many cases, simply being in the wrong location while possessing the wrong facial expression was enough for a constable to declare, "Aha! Caught you, you cunning thief!" Even if the only thing you were trying to steal was a moment of quiet. One of the most amusing, and by amusing we mean horrifying, features of this law was that the absence of stolen property could actually make you look guiltier. If you had nothing in your pockets, police officers would often argue it meant you had thrown the evidence away. If you had a few items in your pockets, that meant you were carrying burglary tools. If your pockets were empty and you explained it, they assumed you were lying. Essentially, the Victorian justice system treated everyone like toddlers caught near a cookie jar. Here's a typical Victorian scenario. Imagine you're walking down the street, minding your own business, possibly thinking about lunch, or possibly thinking about nothing at all because you slept poorly and your brain is operating at coal-powered lantern brightness. You pause in front of a shop window. This is normal behaviour in modern life. In Victorian Britain, congratulations, you are now loitering with intent, which is a poetic way of saying you looked at something for too long. Even worse, many shopkeepers and constables believed that people who walked too slowly were likely planning to steal something, while people who walked too quickly were running away from something they'd already stolen. So your safest option apparently was to hover gently above the ground like an especially anxious ghost. But the real terror came from the fact that police didn't need a witness, a victim, a missing item, or even a coherent narrative. All they needed was a story that sounded vaguely plausible. If a constable declared, "This man appeared to be casing the shop," that was often accepted as truth. And what counted as casing? Looking into a window. Looking near a window. Looking like someone who could look into a window. Having a window within a 3-mile radius of your existence. Victorians had such intense moral panic about crime that they believed a thief could be identified by posture alone. Slouching, criminal, standing too upright, criminal trying to disguise criminality, hands in pockets, criminal warming their theft hands, hands out of pockets, criminal getting ready to use those hands for theft-related activities. And then there were the famous burglar tools. Possessing these was considered absolute proof of intent to steal, except burglar tools included a knife, normal, a screwdriver, normal, a rope, normal, a candle, normal, a nail, absolutely normal. Basically, unless you walked around carrying nothing but moral superiority in a prayer book, you were suspicious. At times the law reached peak absurdity, such as when people were arrested simply for standing near items that could be stolen. A man once faced accusations for stopping to tie his shoe in front of a horse trough because authorities believed he might have been planning to steal the horse. Yes, the horse, because everyone knows the natural progression: shoe untied, horse theft, and the legal system loved this. Courts rewarded preventative policing, meaning that arresting innocent people was seen as proactive and admirable. Judges frequently scolded defendants not for stealing, but for putting themselves into a situation where someone could imagine them stealing. Victorian logic. You claim you had no intention to steal this silver teapot? Correct, sir. But you were in the same room as the teapot? Yes, sir. Aha! Suspicious! To Victorians, temptation was proof of crime. If you could see something nice, you were already guilty of wanting it, and wanting it was morally equivalent to stealing it. Imagine that today, being arrested in an Apple store because you looked at a phone too lovingly. Another juicy detail: repeat arrests counted even if you were innocent every time. Once you were labelled a known suspicious character, every constable in the city felt entitled to arrest you again on sight. You could build an entire criminal record without ever committing an actual crime, a grim Victorian version of going viral. And of course, we must acknowledge the class bias. Wealthy people rarely faced accusations of intent to steal because their intent was always socially approved. Poor people, however, were treated as walking crime potential. A wealthy man lingering near a shop was admiring architecture. A poor man lingering near a shop was preparing Ocean's 11, Foggy London edition. The good news: if you survive Victorian suspicion laws, you probably develop nerves of steel. The bad news? The police assumed that too, because only a guilty man would look that calm. Victorian Britain was a society where clothing didn't just cover you, it announced you, judged you, ranked you, and sometimes got you arrested. If the first part we talk about made poverty illegal, and the second part made suspicious thoughts illegal, this part introduces a new Victorian specialty: making the wrong fashion choice illegal. In a world obsessed with social hierarchy, wearing clothes above your station was seen as a threat to the entire moral universe. Dress too plain and you looked destitute. Dress too fancy, and suddenly you were accused of deception, fraud, or possibly seducing the community through the forbidden powers of fabric. To understand this obsession, you need to imagine Victorian clothing not as fashion, but as social paperwork. Every layer, ruffle, button and bonnet was a document declaring who you were, what you earned, and precisely how respectable you claimed to be. The middle and upper classes treated clothing like a passport. One wrong accessory and immigration officers, also known as judgmental neighbours, would interrogate your very soul. Victorians inherited a long tradition of sumptuary laws, those delightful medieval rules dictating who could wear what. While many of these laws technically faded by the 19th century, the mindset survived like a stubborn family heirloom. Specifically, the kind wrapped in plastic because your grandmother doesn't trust the air. Instead of official government punishments, Victorians policed clothing through social pressure, moral suspicion, and, in many cases, the actual police. Let's begin with the crime of looking richer than you were. Victorians believed that clothing should reflect your true social position, as if your outfit was some kind of wearable tax return. If a lower-class labourer appeared in a jacket that looked too expensive, authorities assumed he had either stolen it, gambled away his virtue, or made suspicious friends. Even worse, they feared he might use this jacket to infiltrate polite society like a fashion-forward spy. A working-class woman in a stylish hat? Clearly she was trying to pass herself off as respectable, and respectable women couldn't have that. Victorian society was a pyramid, and God forbid anyone tried to climb it without the required paperwork, birth certificate, and an ancestral estate complete with emotionally repressed ghosts. Nowhere was this more ridiculous than in the matter of hats. Hats were the Victorian equivalent of social name tags. Wearing the wrong one was basically identity fraud. A silk top hat signalled middle-class respectability, financial stability, and ownership of at least one drawer of neatly folded moral values. If a man of modest means wore such a hat, even a second-hand one, people assumed he was pretending to be wealthy for criminal purposes. Meanwhile, if he wore no hat at all, society concluded he lacked both decency and scalp dignity. Women had it even worse. A woman's bonnet alone could determine whether she was treated as a lady, a servant, a criminal, or a plot twist waiting to happen. A bonnet with too many ribbons? Immoral. A bonnet too plain, probably impoverished, possibly diseased. A bonnet tilted at the wrong angle. Satan's influence, surely. If a woman dared wear a dress made from a fabric nicer than her social class allowed, she risked immediate suspicion of prostitution, theft, or improper ambition. The Victorian equivalent of, "You're getting too confident. Please calm down." Tailoring added another layer of danger. Well-fitted clothes suggested access to a tailor. Access to a tailor suggested money. Money suggested upward mobility. Upward mobility threatened the entire rigid social system, and Victorians reacted to it the way one reacts to a suspiciously moist slice of Victorian-era gingerbread, with fear and moral panic. A man in a well-tailored coat could be accused of fraud, impersonation, or attempting to elevate himself beyond his natural position, a phrase that genuinely appeared in Victorian commentary, often spoken with utter seriousness by people wearing trousers held up with buttons made of poor decisions. But dressing below your social class was also suspicious. If a wealthy man dressed too plainly, it meant he was either hiding something, dabbling in radical politics, or preparing to commit a philanthropic act. The horror! Plain clothing meant he was trying to blend in with commoners, which made everyone uncomfortable. The Victorians loved class distinctions the way Victorians loved lace, excessively, passionately, and with absolutely no regard for when it became ridiculous. Even colour choice could betray you. Bright colours on poorer people were interpreted as vulgarity or deceit, as if only the rich deserved access to the colour spectrum. A factory girl wearing a vibrant shawl might be accused of trying to lure men or imitate higher society. Conversely, if she wore dark, modest colours, she was at risk of being mistaken for a servant, which could lead to employers harassing her about chores she had absolutely no intention of performing. And then there was the fear of social masquerade. Victorians genuinely worried that anyone wearing clothing too nice for their class was playing a long con, trying to trick others into marrying them, hiring them, trusting them, or, worst of all, respecting them. Dressing above your station was seen as moral dishonesty, the sartorial version of lying on a resume. Police officers patrolled wealthy districts looking for imposters, a category so broad it included anyone whose shoes looked too new. Some magistrates even argued that dishonestly dressing as a gentleman was equivalent to intending to swindle or deceive. In other words, your coat wasn't just a coat, it was potential evidence Exhibit A. Yet perhaps the most Victorian crime of all was simply trying to look nice. The good news? Dressing elegantly could boost your confidence. The bad news? That confidence alone was considered suspicious behaviour. Victorian Britain loved rules. They had rules about clothing, rules about talking, rules about breathing politely, and of course rules about what hours of the day you were allowed to exist in public without being accused of villainy. And nothing brought out Victorian paranoia quite like the idea of someone walking around at night. After sunset, the streets transformed from bustling civilization into a crime-ridden moral obstacle course, at least according to every Victorian authority figure with a lantern and an overdeveloped imagination. If you were spotted outside after 10 p.m. without an obvious mission, an official escort, or a glowing halo announcing your purity, congratulations, you are now legally classified as suspicious. Suspicious was Victorian for, we don't know what you're doing, but we're deeply offended that you're doing it. Nighttime wanderers were assumed to be up to something. What that something was didn't matter. Night watchmen already knew it was crime. Walking home from work? Crime. Taking a shortcut? Crime. Getting fresh air? Absolutely crime. Looking at the moon fondly? Very suspicious, possibly witchcraft. Victorian society divided people into two categories: good, respectable citizens who went inside before the street lamps flickered on, and everyone else who was obviously plotting burglary, seduction, or treason. And nobody embodied this suspicious worldview more dramatically than the night watchman. Night watchmen were supposed to maintain order after dark. In practice, they roamed the streets like paranoid owls with badges, deeply committed, easily startled, and absolutely convinced that every shadow was a threat. To them, nighttime was not a time of peace, quiet, or stargazing. It was when society's moral fabric dissolved faster than damp Victorian wallpaper. Watchmen believed the following to be incontrovertibly true. Nobody good walked around after dark. Anyone walking around after dark was suspicious. Anyone suspicious was probably a criminal, therefore anyone walking after dark was a criminal. This impressive logic loop allowed them to arrest practically anyone they wanted. Simply strolling after 10 p.m. could get you stopped and interrogated. The watchman's lantern would flash directly into your face like a judgment spotlight, and suddenly you were starring in an impromptu Victorian police drama. "What's your business out here?" "Going home, sir." "After dark?" "Yes." Likely story. Your innocence didn't matter. Innocence after sunset was considered an urban legend. The official crime was usually listed as wandering after dusk, a phrase that makes it sound like you were a cursed medieval knight instead of someone who missed the last omnibus. Wandering after dusk implied you were either scouting for crimes, avoiding being seen, or simply out of place, which was practically a misdemeanor all on its own. Victorian cities had very strict ideas about who belonged where and when. Walking through a wealthy district at night, criminal. Passing through a working-class street late at night, criminal. Crossing a bridge, suspicious. Standing under a lamppost, suspicious. Standing between lampposts, suspicious and dramatically lit, definitely guilty. And heaven help you if you paused, hesitated, or turned around too quickly. Watchmen interpreted hesitation as criminal indecision. Turning around was proof you'd spotted the watchman and panicked. Even walking with confidence could be suspicious. Only a criminal would walk confidently to throw off suspicion. Essentially, no human posture or movement pattern was safe. Nighttime also heightened Victorian fear of loitering. Loitering was a marvellous catch-all offence that could be applied to anyone doing anything less than sprinting with purpose. Leaning against a wall, loitering, waiting for a friend, loitering, adjusting your shoes, loitering, thinking, absolutely loitering and possibly immoral. Once a watchman decided you were loitering with no respectable reason, the situation could escalate instantly. Many people were dragged into station house because they lingered, dawdled, looked restless, or appeared to be waiting. Waiting for what? The Victorians didn't know, but they were sure it was nothing good. Workers with night shifts were especially vulnerable. Bakers, dock workers, messengers, printers and servants all frequently travelled after dark, and all were routinely accused of criminal activity simply for existing outside traditional hours. You could protest all you wanted. "I'm on my way to work." But Victorian society believed respectable work only occurred during daylight hours, except for servants, who were expected to work every hour but still never be seen. Women faced an even harsher reality. A woman walking alone after dark was automatically labelled immoral, dangerous, or both. She wasn't simply out of place. She was an omen. In the Victorian worldview, decent women evaporated into their homes at sunset like obedient vampires returning to their crypts. If a woman remained visible, night watchmen assumed she must be involved in scandalous business. By contrast, wealthy men walking at night were rarely questioned, unless they wandered into poor neighbourhoods. Then watchmen assumed they were looking for trouble, or worse, trying to mingle with the lower classes. And nothing terrified Victorian authorities more than cross-class mingling in the moonlight. The best part, these nighttime arrests didn't even require evidence of wrongdoing, only the watchman's imagination, which tended to operate on maximum drama. If he thought your footsteps sounded sneaky, or your shadow looked too elongated, or you walked too close to a building, he could detain you. The good news? If you survived Victorian nights without being arrested, You probably mastered the art of walking with suspiciously perfect neutrality. The bad news, even that was considered suspicious. If you've ever cracked a joke that didn't land, consider yourself lucky you weren't living in Victorian Britain, the era where comedy wasn't just frowned upon, it was practically a misdemeanor. In a society that treated emotional expression like a dangerous chemical, humour was a highly controlled substance, and if someone believed your joke was rude, improper, or even delivered with the wrong level of enthusiasm, well, the magistrate would like a word. Victorian Britain had an almost Olympic-level commitment to suppressing spontaneous joy. They believed laughter should be neat, quiet, morally uplifting, and preferably occur only indoors, while sitting upright, supervised by at least 3 stern relatives. Anything else, anything that sounded too hearty, too cheeky, too rowdy, or too human, fell under the umbrella of disorderly conduct, and disorderly conduct was a crime. Let's start with the crime of insulting language. Modern insults range from witty to mildly questionable, but Victorian Britain's standard for insulting was so low that even a frustrated sigh could be interpreted as social rebellion. If you swore, you were done. If you muttered something under your breath, you were done. If you muttered something not under your breath, you might be escorted directly to court. The list of banned phrases was long, imaginative, and included expressions so mild they barely qualify as adjectives today. Calling someone a rascal, for example, could lead to legal trouble. Scoundrel, risky, idiot, absolutely inappropriate for public consumption. And God help you if you said something truly cutting like, "You have no sense of humour," the Victorian equivalent of a nuclear insult. But even non-insults could cause problems. Sarcasm, which Victorians considered a moral failing, could get you fined, especially if used toward authority figures. Making fun of a policeman? Automatic trouble. Making fun of a clergyman? Expect divine punishment and a legal one. Making fun of a magistrate? Bold move. Enjoy prison. And then there was the crime of improper language. This didn't necessarily mean anything obscene. It often meant language that was too casual, too familiar, too expressive, too emotional, or simply too alive. Talking loudly could be improper. Talking playfully could be improper. Joking with strangers? Absolutely improper and possibly immoral. Which brings us to my personal favourite Victorian criminal offence. Immoderate laughter. Yes, not just laughter, immoderate laughter. The kind that sounded too genuine. Too uncontrolled. Too joyful. The kind that suggests you've forgotten, for one brief second, that life is supposed to be a grim parade of polite misery. London court records from the era are filled with cases where individuals were fined or chastised for laughing boisterously in public. Imagine being hauled before a judge for laughing too hard at a friend's joke. What is the charge? He laughed excessively, Your Honour. I see. 30 days without smiling. Even smiling could be suspicious if it happened at the wrong time or toward the wrong person. Smiling at a stranger was considered forward. Smiling at someone of higher rank? Insolent. Smiling too much in general? A sign your moral compass needed recalibration. Public houses were hotspots for disorderly laughter arrests. Music, alcohol, and the slightest sense of relaxation created the perfect conditions for comedic chaos. The moment someone laughed uproariously, authorities assumed the situation was spiralling into anarchy. To the Victorian police, a group of people laughing was indistinguishable from a revolution planning meeting. Street performers often faced fines for encouraging improper laughter. If the crowd enjoyed themselves too much, the performer was accused of stirring disorder. In other words, Victorian entertainers played a dangerous game. They had to be amusing enough to earn coins, but not so amusing that the audience forgot to laugh politely. But the harshest treatment was reserved for women, particularly young working-class women. If a woman laughed loudly in public, she was considered immodest. If she cracked a joke, she was considered dangerous. And if she responded with sass or bold humour, she was often labelled morally corrupted, or worse, mistaken for a troublemaker. There were even recorded instances of women being reprimanded by police for giggling excessively while unaccompanied. In Victorian logic, giggling without a chaperone was basically an invitation to sin. Men didn't escape scrutiny either. A man who used crude jokes could be fined for spreading corruption. A man who traded street banter with friends could be charged with disturbing the peace. A man who used colourful language toward law enforcement was practically pre-booked for jail. Even children weren't safe. Kids shouting jokes or making funny noises were often told off by officers or adults because humour was dangerous. It encouraged imagination, which encouraged independence, which encouraged disaster. To sum it up, swearing, crime. Teasing, crime. Laughing too loudly, crime. Making a joke in the wrong tone, crime. Using humour to cope with the absolute chaos of Victorian life, definitely a crime. The good news, if you managed to laugh in Victorian Britain, you had a strong will and an even stronger diaphragm. The bad news, someone standing nearby probably wrote down your laughter as evidence. Victorian Britain had a deep spiritual fear of noise, especially noise it did not schedule, approve or understand. They believed civilization was held together by silence, politeness and the gentle hum of people pretending everything was fine. Anything louder than a controlled cough was a threat to the empire's fragile emotional infrastructure. Which brings us to one of the era's most beloved catch-all criminal categories, disturbing the peace. Peace in Victorian legal terms meant the sound level preferred by someone wealthy enough to write a complaint. And disturbing that peace could involve anything from shouting to singing, or yes, even sneezing with suspicious enthusiasm. Let's begin with the crime of brawling. Now, you might be imagining fistfights in alleys, bar fights, chairs flying, Dickensian chaos. But to Victorian authorities, the brawling didn't require fists at all. You could brawl simply by raising your voice in disagreement. Arguments between spouses. Brawling. Debates between neighbours. Brawling. Two men animatedly discussing cricket. Potential brawling. Basically, if a constable couldn't immediately tell who was winning the conversation, he assumed it was a fight. Creating a tumult, another favourite Victorian phrase, was even more ridiculous. A tumult could be anything that made people look in the same direction at once. A startled shout, tumult. Dropping a bag of groceries, tumult. Tripping on uneven cobblestones, tumult, with extra suspicion if you cursed on the way down. But the real fun begins when we examine just how low the noise threshold actually was. Victorians were easily startled creatures, like upright hedgehogs in waistcoats, a cartwheel squeaking too loudly, a disturbance, a dog barking twice in a row, public nuisance, a baby crying in a way one might describe as baby-like, noise pollution. Consider the documented cases where individuals were reprimanded or fined for singing in public. Not obscene lyrics, not drunken shouting, just singing. The problem wasn't the content, it was the volume and the spontaneity. Spontaneous anything made Victorians nervous. If you burst into song on a public street, people assumed something dreadful had happened to you mentally, morally, or musically. Street vendors faced constant trouble for calling out their goods too loudly. Imagine working 14 hours a day selling fish or vegetables, only to be fined because your voice carried 5 inches farther than the law deemed acceptable. Authorities insisted vendors speak modestly, which is a hilarious instruction for someone trying to get the attention of pedestrians over the sound of horses, carts, chimney sweep boys and general Victorian chaos. Then there were the cases involving public house noise. Taverns were required by the law to keep peace and order, which sounds noble until you realise peace and order meant absolute quiet, preferably with everyone drinking silently like anxious monks. If patrons clinked their mugs too energetically, or cheered for anything, the weather, the ale, the fact that their life hadn't collapsed that morning, the owners could be charged with failing to control noise. Children, as usual, were considered walking noise violations. Kids playing ball in the street, disturbing the peace. Kids laughing too loudly, tumult. Kids shouting a rhyme or skipping rope, a menace. Victorian adults believed children should be seen but not heard, and preferably only seen after being washed, dressed properly, and trained to sit very still. But perhaps the most comically tragic of all noise-related crimes was the accusation of disorderly sneezing. Victorian records mention individuals being reprimanded for loud expulsions and improper explosions of breath. After all, nothing says public danger like someone with hay fever. Imagine sneezing in the middle of the street, startling a horse, making a lady jump, and causing a watchman to whirl around as if you'd fired a cannon. Suddenly you're being lectured about manners, fined for disrupting public harmony, and advised to control yourself, as though one can negotiate politely with pollen. And let's not forget the horror of nighttime noise. Victorians already treated nighttime as a sacred realm of silence, broken only by the occasional cough, creaking house, or lonely carriage. Making noise after dark was practically a declaration of war. Neighbours frequently summoned authorities because someone dropped a pot, sneezed, or walked too heavily on the floorboards. To them, heavy footsteps indicated criminal intent, existential despair, or a weak moral character. What made noise crimes especially absurd was the selective enforcement. Wealthy neighbourhoods had noise laws enforced with military precision, while working-class districts existed in a state of constant auditory combat. Factories clanging, vendors shouting, trains screeching, drunks singing, dogs barking, and chimneys erupting. Yet it was typically the poorest residents who were punished for noise, because they were the easiest targets. Meanwhile, factory owners whose machines made enough noise to shake the cobblestones. Perfectly acceptable. That was progress. Noise made by children? Unacceptable. Noise made by factory machines that could burst your eardrum? Very acceptable. Noise made by a poor man coughing? Jail time. Noise made by Queen Victoria's carriage parade? National celebration? The good news, noise crimes taught Victorians how to suppress every natural impulse, which is probably why they all look so stiff in photographs. The bad news? If you sneezed with too much confidence, someone was ready to declare you an enemy of public tranquility. If you ever felt bad about indulging in gossip, just be thankful you didn't live in Victorian Britain, the era where whispering the wrong thing could get you sued, fined, dragged to court, or publicly humiliated. Victorians treated reputation like oxygen, essential, fragile, and dangerously flammable, and anyone who tampered with it, accidentally or enthusiastically, risked committing a socially lethal offence. Victorian society ran on a delicate economy of appearances. While their legal system was obsessed with theft, vagrancy, and improper bonnets, their social system was obsessed with something even more precious. Reputation, the currency that decided where you could live, who you could marry, which social circles would tolerate your existence, and how loudly your neighbours would judge you. Maintaining reputation required constant vigilance, ritualised politeness, and a silent agreement that everyone would pretend the world was less chaotic than it actually was, which meant gossip, tiny, delicious, scandalous gossip, was basically radioactive material, and spreading it? That was social arson. Let's begin with the basics. Victorian gossip wasn't casual. Saying the wrong thing about the wrong person could trigger a lawsuit faster than someone fainting at the sight of an exposed table leg. Even insinuations were dangerous. If your neighbour heard you say, "Well, I'm not saying Mrs. Pembroke's hair looks suspiciously fuller this month," you could be accused of slander, defamation, or malicious mischief, a legal term that sounds like something invented to punish toddlers. Victorian accusations came in many flavours. 1. Slander, subsequent insults or rumours. This was the verbal crime. Even hinting that someone was lazy, dishonest, unclean, drunk, or heaven forbid, less respectable than their wallpaper could land you in trouble. One careless remark at a tea party could explode across a neighbourhood like social dynamite. 2. Libel, written insults or rumours. If you wrote something defamatory, the consequences were even worse. Printing, publishing, or scribbling down gossip raised the offence from dangerous whisper to textual assault. Victorian courts adored libel cases. They were dramatic, public, and dripping with moral outrage. Newspapers frequently got sued for implying a gentleman's finances were unstable or a lady's virtue had been misplaced. 3. Scandal mongering. This was the Victorian version of starting drama. You didn't even need to spread false information, just stirring up trouble for entertainment could be treated as a crime of character. 4. rumour pollution. Yes, pollution. Victorians genuinely believed gossip contaminated moral spaces. One rumour could ruin a household, 10 rumours could ruin a village, 100 rumours. The clergy would declare a moral emergency, but it wasn't just legality, it was social survival. Victorians believed that reputation was the backbone of civilization, and anyone who tampered with it was basically inviting society to collapse into chaos, anarchy, and possibly spontaneous dancing. Let's talk about targets. If you gossiped about someone from a wealthy or influential family, you were playing with dynamite in a candle factory. These families guarded their reputations like priceless relics, and they weaponized both the courts and social networks to protect them. Calling a nobleman a scoundrel? Bold choice. Enjoy the lawsuit. Hinting a merchant's daughter had been unchaperoned? Immediate consequences. Suggesting a respectable widow had remarried too quickly? Prepare for verbal warfare. The hierarchy was simple. The higher someone's social position, the louder they exploded when gossiped about. Victorian courts were flooded with cases where people sued each other for remarks made at dinner parties, in letters, on the street, in church, or, most hilariously, through misinterpreted facial expressions. If your face looked too disapproving when someone entered the room, that alone could be interpreted as defamation in bodily form. Meanwhile, working-class neighbourhoods had a different system. Their communities relied heavily on reputation too, but they handled gossip through social discipline rather than legal action. If someone spread harmful rumours, they would be confronted, scolded, frozen out, or, if exceptionally unlucky, publicly humiliated at the local pub. These punishments were highly effective and required no paperwork. And then there were the gossip vigilantes, women who considered it their moral duty to maintain neighbourhood righteousness by reporting every suspicious behaviour, clothing choice, visitor, sound, shadow or hairstyle to everyone within a 5-house radius. If they sensed impropriety, they spread that information like wildfire fueled by indignation. Ironically, these women were some of the biggest creators of moral pollution, but because they framed their gossip as concern, society politely let them continue their crusades. Victorian anxiety about gossip was so intense that self-censorship became a survival technique. People spoke in riddles, hints, and coded language to avoid direct accusations. Conversations were like polite combat, everyone dancing around unspoken landmines. Saying "she is different" could mean 20 things, all terrible, depending on the tone. Saying "he has habits" could ruin a man's career. Even silence could be dangerous. If someone asked, "What do you think of Mr. Hardwick?" and you answered nothing, your pause alone was gossip. In Victorian Britain, not saying anything was often interpreted as saying everything. But perhaps the most Victorian thing of all was the belief that a damaged reputation was worse than physical injury. People genuinely testified in court that insults had caused them indescribable suffering, loss of social standing, and in one case, persistent headaches caused by shame. Meanwhile, someone injured by a carriage would simply get up, dust themselves off, and apologise for bleeding on the roadway. The good news, if you avoided gossip in Victorian Britain, you were either a saint or profoundly unobservant. The bad news, everyone else was talking about you anyway. In the Victorian era, the church was not just a place of worship, it was where society checked your moral temperature, inspected your respectability, and silently judged your posture. Sunday service wasn't optional. It was mandatory public evidence that you were a functioning, God-fearing cog in the imperial machine. Missing church wasn't merely a spiritual oversight, it was a public relations disaster. In Victorian culture, religion was surveillance with better architecture. Fail to show up regularly, and people began whispering. Miss too many Sundays, and those whispers turned into theories. And once theories began, you might as well turn yourself in, because Victorians believed that skipping church was a gateway sin, a starter crime leading inevitably to drunkenness, gambling, theft, moral collapse, and possibly ballroom dancing on a weekday. Let's begin with the most basic truth. Sunday visibility determined your moral worth. Attending church each week signaled that you were respectable, obedient, and spiritually aligned with the moral universe. Sitting in your pew, preferably stiff as a wooden plank, was proof that you were not engaged in any sinful activity like resting, sleeping, gardening, or enjoying a peaceful moment alone. Your presence in church was a public alibi. Your absence was a public accusation. Communities monitored attendance with near military precision. Parish records were meticulously kept, and missing from that list even once could raise eyebrows. Missing twice? Questions. Missing repeatedly? A full investigation conducted by the unofficial Neighbourhood Reputation Committee, which consisted of every elderly woman within half a mile. But the real trouble came from official authorities. While Victorian law didn't always strictly require church attendance everywhere, many local ordinances and social structures treated absence as a sign of moral instability. And moral instability, in Victorian logic, was practically criminal. Why? Because Victorians believed crime stemmed from moral weakness, and moral weakness stemmed from not listening to enough sermons telling you not to be morally weak. Therefore, miss church, lose morality, become a criminal, society collapses, the empire dissolves, someone blames it on Irish immigrants. In some towns, the police themselves monitored the streets on Sunday mornings. If they saw you strolling about instead of being inside a church, they interpreted it as defiance. Loitering on the Sabbath was not exactly illegal everywhere, but it was considered deeply unwise. Imagine taking a peaceful walk and being stopped by an officer who demanded to know why you weren't sitting in a pew staring at stained glass. And it wasn't just the law, it was economic survival. Employers kept an eye on who attended church. A worker who skipped services risked being labelled unreliable. A servant who stayed home on Sunday might be accused of moral decay or laziness. Some employers even demanded proof of church attendance, treating the pew like an early version of a time clock. Landlords too took church-going seriously. Renting a home to someone who didn't attend Sunday service was a risky investment. You were essentially renting to a person one missed sermon away from utter sin. Marriage prospects? Non-existent. Victorians believed that someone who skipped church would eventually skip their marital duties too. Not attending Sunday service meant you were a ticking time bomb of irresponsibility. Then there were the clergy, who treated absenteeism like a personal attack. If you didn't show up, your minister would make it his mission to know why. Maybe you'd receive a friendly visit, which was Victorian for sanctified interrogation. Ministers would appear at your door like holy detectives. We didn't see you on Sunday. Are you unwell, spiritually withering, secretly rebellious, or simply courting eternal damnation? Even if you had a perfectly valid excuse, illness, injury, a family emergency, a chimney collapse, the minister might still urge you to reflect upon the importance of consistency. In Victorian thinking, anything less than 100% attendance was spiritual negligence. Meanwhile, Victorians regularly worked themselves to exhaustion, barely slept, risked fatal diseases daily, and lived among air pollution thick enough to butter bread with. But missed church? Now that was dangerous, and the social consequences didn't end there. A person who skipped church risked being connected to all sorts of imagined misdeeds. People whispered, "He wasn't at church, I heard he might be drinking." She missed service. Poor thing must be falling into moral darkness. They haven't been seen in weeks. I fear they've become free thinkers. Free thinkers. The horror. The idea of spending Sunday morning in quiet solitude, reading, resting, or contemplating life was terrifying to Victorians. They believed leisure on the Sabbath was one dainty step away from lawlessness. That's why some regions enforced Sabbath laws that bordered on comedic. No games, no music, no dancing, no unnecessary walking, no unnecessary talking, no smiling too freely. Look suspicious. Essentially, rest was forbidden unless performed inside the church under supervision. You might think the poor had it easier, but no. Church attendance was even more strictly demanded from them. The wealthy could take religious retreats, extended vacations. The poor were expected to prove their virtue through unwavering pew attendance. A wealthy man missing service was travelling. A poor man missing service was backsliding into degeneracy. The good news: if you attended church regularly, society trusted you, whether or not you actually listened to a single sermon. The bad news: one missed Sunday and everyone assumed you were morally unravelling like a cheap Victorian lace collar. If you think modern food regulation is strict, imagine Victorian Britain, a place so paranoid about food adulteration that merely selling a sandwich could make you a national threat. It was an age where bread might contain chalk, pickles might glow faintly in candlelight, and chocolate might include ingredients found naturally in a respectable broom closet. People didn't just worry about what they ate, they feared it. Food was a mystery box of questionable textures and alarming colours. So the government, in its eternal wisdom, decided to regulate food in a way that perfectly combined Victorian moral panic with Victorian overreach, by punishing anyone who looked like they might be selling something suspicious. Enter Chapter 9: The Crime of Suspicious Cuisine. Victorian Britain's adulteration crisis wasn't entirely imaginary. Some sellers truly did stretch their ingredients with creative additions. Flour was whitened with chalk. Cows were padded with water before they became milk. Pepper was cut with sweepings from the floor. Flavourful? No. Fibrous? Absolutely. But the authorities' reaction to these problems went far beyond addressing legitimate health concerns. Instead, they launched a crusade against anyone whose food didn't visually fit Victorian expectations. Let's begin with the visual standards of the day. Victorians expected bread to be perfectly white enough to imply clouds, angels, and moral purity. Bread that looked even slightly beige was suspicious. Bread that looked rustic was foreign. Bread that looked healthy was definitely a crime. So when poor bakers tried to sell darker loaves made from whole grains, barley, rye, or anything not bleached into oblivion, they were accused of adulteration. Ironically, the chalk bread was considered respectable because it looked right. Meanwhile, honest bread was treated like contraband. Pickles were another battlefield. Victorians loved unnaturally bright pickles, especially the kind dyed with copper compounds until they glowed like radioactive emeralds. These neon demon pickles signalled quality to Victorians, because who wouldn't trust a vegetable that defied the visible spectrum? Street vendors selling naturally pale cucumber pickles were fined for deceptive and inferior goods, while vendors selling toxic green ones were applauded for maintaining tradition. Chocolate was even more dramatic. Because chocolate was expensive, many sellers mixed in whatever brown substances they could find. Flour, sawdust, brick powder, and occasionally dirt swept from respectable corners of the shop. The authorities reacted by creating strict guidelines, which were then used to arrest food sellers, whether or not their chocolate was actually adulterated. The accusation of food fraud became a weapon. A vendor didn't need to be proven guilty. Suspicion alone was enough. Street sellers were especially vulnerable because their goods were openly displayed and frequently judged by passers-by who would confidently declare, "That pie looks suspicious," even though Victorian pie fillings were legally unverifiable and spiritually chaotic. The food inspectors of the time were a special breed. Armed with clipboards and an unshakable belief in their own importance, they patrolled markets like culinary detectives. If your bread rose oddly, your pickles lacked shine, or your pudding looked too humble, inspectors assumed something devious was afoot. They inspected everything with the severity of surgeons, sniffing loaves, poking sausages, and occasionally licking powders, a method both unscientific and deeply brave. But here's the fun twist. Many street sellers were safer than shops. Street food vendors often used fresher ingredients because they couldn't afford to waste product. Their food had no time to rot. It was eaten immediately. Meanwhile, wealthier shops had the luxury of displaying food until it acquired both character and its own weather system. Despite this, street vendors were the ones fined most often. They had little protection and no influential friends. Meanwhile, large shops could hire lawyers, bribe inspectors, or simply argue that their toxic green pickles had been prepared in accordance with traditional methods, as if tradition excused glowing vegetables. The most absurd part? Suspicious food didn't actually need to be bad, it just needed to look wrong. Suspicious appearance was a genuine legal phrase that inspectors used to justify fines. If your pastry was misshapen, if your fruit lacked shine, if your cheese was too crumbly, if your meat wasn't the right shade of Victorian red, you could be accused of selling inferior or fraudulent goods. Even smells were regulated. If your stall smelled too savoury, too sweet, too smoky, or too unfamiliar, you were in trouble. Basically, if your food had the audacity to smell like actual food, you risked arrest. The most heartbreaking victims of this paranoia were immigrant vendors, people selling foods unfamiliar to British palates. Italian chestnuts, Jewish bagels, Indian spices were often accused of adulteration simply because their products confused authorities. Never mind that these foods were often higher quality than local options. Confusion alone was enough to trigger suspicion. Ultimately, the crime of selling suspicious food became one more way Victorian society policed the poor. You didn't need to harm anyone. You just needed to present a loaf of bread that looked slightly too beige. The good news, some of the era's food laws eventually led to improved safety standards. The bad news, they began with punishing innocent vendors for the heinous crime of selling bread that wasn't chalk white. If Victorian Britain had a superpower, it was turning absolutely normal behaviour into something scandalous, especially when women were involved. And nothing demonstrates this better than the bizarre reality that a woman simply existing on a street corner could be accused of prostitution. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to gesture. She could be waiting for her sister, catching her breath, or contemplating the meaning of life and still risk legal or social ruin. This wasn't just judgment, it was policy. Victorian society built its entire identity around the concept of feminine virtue. Fragile, sacred, and apparently allergic to street corners. A proper Victorian woman was expected to move through public spaces like a faint breeze, lightly, quietly, and preferably not at all. The less visible she was, the more respectable people assumed her to be, which meant that being visible in the wrong place at the wrong moment could trigger consequences that were instant, unfair, and viciously gendered. Let's start with the geography of scandal. Victorian cities were divided, not officially but socially, into respectable zones and danger zones. Respectable zones were places women were expected to be: churches, markets, milliners' shops, and the homes of relatives with whom they were forced to make polite conversation. Danger zones, however, included busy intersections, tavern-adjacent sidewalks, bridges, alley mouths outside theatres near the entrances to railway stations, anywhere with more foot traffic than oxygen. But the worst of all? Street corners. The Victorian imagination believed that every street corner was a moral trapdoor waiting for a woman to fall through it. Why corners? Because corners were where men congregated, where deals happened, where traffic flowed, where gossip circulated, and where night watchmen concentrated their suspicions. Corners were public stages, visible, chaotic, unavoidable. So if a woman stood there alone, authorities assumed she was waiting for customers. Though to be fair, if a Victorian watchman stood there alone, he was performing his duty. The hypocrisy could be cut with a butter knife. Under the Contagious Diseases Acts and related policing customs, women suspected of solicitation could be stopped, questioned, searched, detained and forced into humiliating medical examinations, all without having committed a crime. Suspicion was enough, and suspicion was often defined as standing still, walking slowly, making eye contact, avoiding eye contact, looking tired, looking confident, looking like someone who needed directions existing. It was essentially a choose-your-own-adventure of misogyny. Night patrols were especially dangerous. After dusk, women in public were treated like walking red flags. A mother running errands at twilight? Suspicious. A factory worker heading home after a late shift? Clearly immoral. A seamstress delivering finished garments? A likely temptress. The reality of women's labour meant nothing compared to the Victorian obsession with policing their bodies. And worst of all, women didn't even have to be alone. There are documented cases where women standing with female friends were still accused of solicitation, simply because groups of lower-class women were assumed to be roaming public spaces for sinful purposes. A woman could be on her way to visit family, holding a basket full of groceries or flowers, and still be stopped. Context did not matter. Intent did not matter. Respectability did not matter. In some police districts, officers were taught to look for telltale signs of prostitution, signs which included standing as though waiting, lingering after glancing about, holding oneself in a suggestive posture, which could be interpreted as leaning or shifting weight, looking too boldly, looking too shyly, being idle, being too energetic. Essentially, unless a woman performed the exact choreography of middle-class modesty, while briskly walking from one pre-approved destination to another, she risked suspicion. But the real cruelty of this system was how it targeted working-class women. Middle and upper-class women were almost never accused, because they usually travelled by carriage or accompanied by servants. Meanwhile, working-class women walked everywhere alone. They had no protection except the hope that the local constable was in a generous mood, which was statistically unlikely. Women employed in nightlife-adjacent trades, flower girls, seamstresses, music hall attendants, barmaids, tobacco sellers, were especially vulnerable. Their mere presence in busy areas after dark made them suspect, and once a woman was labelled known to police, she carried that stigma for years, often with no way to clear her name. And social consequences could be devastating. Being accused, not convicted, could cost a woman her job, her housing, her family's trust, and any hope of climbing out of poverty. A rumour was enough to collapse her entire social existence like a poorly built Victorian conservatory roof. Even more disturbingly, some constables used accusations strategically. There were cases where women were threatened with arrest unless they left certain areas, avoided certain streets, or complied with vague behavioural demands. In other words, the accusation of street walking became a tool of control, legal, moral, and physical. Victorian men, of course, faced none of this. A man standing on a street corner was a citizen. A woman standing there was a problem. The good news? If a Victorian woman managed to exist in public without scandal, she possessed incredible discipline, timing, and spatial awareness. The bad news? A single misplaced footstep could turn her daily errand into a criminal implication. Victorian Britain had many fears: industrial accidents, cholera outbreaks, weak tea, but none compared to its greatest terror: uncontrolled human emotion occurring in public. If you laughed too loudly, cried too openly, or expressed yourself with anything more than the emotional enthusiasm of a granite statue, society considered you a threat to public order. Victorians believed that emotions, real, messy, spontaneous emotions, were volatile substances that should be kept tightly sealed, preferably in a small ornamental jar on the mantelpiece. To show emotion openly was to suggest that your inner life was not fully shackled to propriety, and an unshackled inner life, well, that was one melodramatic hand flutter away from total social collapse. Let's begin with laughter, the most dangerous of Victorian emotional crimes. Victorians adored proper, modest, polite laughter, the kind that sounded like a cough wearing a corset. Anything heartier, freer, or louder than a gentle exhale could be classified as excessive mirth. Excessive mirth wasn't encouraged, wasn't tolerated. It was a punishable offence. Imagine laughing so hard at a friend's joke that you nearly doubled over. To Victorian, that was basically a public riot. People nearby would stiffen, stare, or cross the street to avoid being contaminated by your reckless joy. Authorities sometimes interpreted excessive laughter as drunkenness, disorderliness, or evidence that you were the sort of person who might forget yourself and eat dessert before dinner. One poor man was once reprimanded for laughing uproariously in the coachyard because his laughter startled a horse and caused the coachman to drop his pipe. This wasn't his fault, but it didn't stop the constable from giving him a stern lecture about decorum. Victorians genuinely believed that loud laughter could unhinge the delicate nerves of passers-by. Crying posed an equal threat. Public tears, especially when dramatic or prolonged, were considered disruptive, even dangerous. Women were allowed a limited amount of delicate eye-dabbing, but anything beyond that crossed into boisterous feeling. Boisterous feeling meant you had failed in your sacred duty to hide your humanity. Cry long enough and someone would summon a clergyman, or worse, a policeman. Men were punished even more harshly. A man crying in public wasn't merely emotional, he was deemed unstable, irrational, possibly drunk, or clearly unfit for serious work. A man who shed tears on a street corner risked being labelled unmanly, unreliable, or a potential danger to society's emotional equilibrium. Victorian masculinity required an emotional range of exactly 3 acceptable states: neutral, stoic, and subtly disappointed. Then there were the emotional artists, people who gestured too broadly while talking, who spoke with too much passion, who looked too excited about anything. Victorians called this improper display, and they loathed it. If your arms moved too freely, people assumed you were foreign. If your voice rose in pitch, they assumed you were hysterical. And if your face showed more expression than a decorative door knocker, you were clearly losing control. Public celebrations were especially dangerous. Sporting victories, military announcements, street performances, any situation where emotions tended to spike could lead to accusations of tumultuous behaviour. Tumultuous behaviour meant you had contributed to an atmosphere of excitement which was considered only 3 degrees removed from rebellion. Theatres were hotspots for emotional crime. Audiences sometimes became too enthusiastic, cheering, clapping or laughing beyond acceptable Victorian limits. Theatre managers were responsible for keeping emotions respectable, meaning they had to shush their own customers. Imagine watching a thrilling performance, bursting into applause, and immediately being told to tone it down before the police got involved. And don't even consider crying at a tragic play with anything louder than a sniff. Victorians loved their tragedies quiet and dignified, not drenched in actual human feeling. If you sobbed too loudly during King Lear, other audience members would glare at you as though you had personally insulted Shakespeare. Children were frequent offenders, a child laughing too enthusiastically in a park. Disorderly, a child crying over a scraped knee. Uncontrolled emotion. Victorian parents responded to emotional outbursts by immediately shushing, scolding, or dragging the offending miniature human home for a lecture about restraint. Childhood emotions were treated as moral tests from God. Public displays of affection were similarly alarming. A couple holding hands with visible tenderness could be accused of indecent familiarity, while a couple arguing could be accused of creating disturbance. Victorians craved the emotional neutrality of wax figures with better posture. Even religious emotion had limits. Church sermons sometimes moved people, but too much weeping or too much shouting "Amen" could draw scrutiny. Religious extremity was suspicious unless it was the quiet, internalized suffering Victorians considered respectable. The strangest part: emotional policing was considered a form of public safety. Authorities genuinely believed they were protecting society by reducing emotional volatility. They feared that strong feelings, joy, anger, grief, could spread like contagion, leading to chaos. If one person laughed too loudly, another might join in, and before long you'd have a disturbance. Thus, Victorian emotional restraint wasn't simply cultural, it was enforced. Public emotion became a punishable act, and those who failed to contain themselves learned quickly that the safest Victorian expression was no expression at all. The good news: if you mastered emotional repression, you fit right in. The bad news: failure to repress could earn you a stern lecture, a fine, or a reputation as someone who could not be trusted with their own face. Victorian Britain was a place where paperwork ruled all things: your job, your morality, your sanity, your worthiness, and naturally your pets. If you thought owning an animal was a simple matter of love, companionship, or needing something to eat all the crumbs you dropped, think again. In Victorian society, every creature you owned, from pampered spaniels to suspiciously loud geese, needed a license, and woe unto you if you didn't have the proper documents. Forget to register your dog? Criminal. Forget to renew the license? Criminal. Forget which pocket you stored the license in, and fail to produce it when the constable demanded to see it? Absolutely criminal. Victorians feared unlicensed animals the way modern people fear tax mistakes. They treated animal registration as a civic duty, a moral obligation, and an essential pillar of law and order. An unlicensed pet wasn't just a bureaucratic oversight, it was a social hazard, a moral threat, and potentially a gateway to chaos. After all, what kind of person owned a dog without the appropriate amount of paperwork? Clearly someone who had no respect for civilization. Let's start with the infamous dog tax, a policy so beloved by authorities and so despised by everyone else that it turned half the nation into reluctant fugitives. The dog tax required every dog owner to pay an annual fee and display proof of payment. Officers patrolled neighbourhoods searching for unlicensed dogs, which resulted in some truly comical scenes. Dogs sprinting away with the determination of Olympic sprinters, owners claiming the dog wasn't theirs, and confused animals being forced to pose for identification. Having an unlicensed dog could lead to fines or confiscation. And when the authorities said confiscation, they didn't mean sending your dog to a comfortable kennel. No, they meant taking it to a municipal pound where it would await judgment like an accused criminal. The dog didn't understand the charges, but the owners certainly did. But dogs weren't the only creatures under strict surveillance. Victorians licensed everything: horses, pigs, pigeons, goats, and yes, even geese. If your goose wandered into public without proper registration, you were guilty of goose delinquency, a crime both absurd and very real. The authorities viewed unlicensed geese as potential troublemakers, rowdy, unpredictable, and capable of inciting rural rebellion with their honks. In some towns, geese were so strictly regulated that goosekeeping associations formed to help owners navigate the legal labyrinth. Imagine attending a meeting where dozens of respectable Victorians discuss goose permits with grave seriousness. Meanwhile, cats escaped licensing for a depressing reason. Victorians considered cats semi-wild creatures that existed more as pest control than pets. They roamed freely, owned no one, obeyed no authority, and behaved exactly the way cats behave today, with complete disdain for human paperwork. Exotic pets posed even bigger problems. Wealthier Victorians loved collecting unusual animals: monkeys, parrots, raccoons, and occasionally creatures that absolutely did not belong in a British climate. They displayed these animals as status symbols, showing them off in parlours as if they were rare pieces of art that sometimes bit guests. But the authorities insisted these exotic creatures be documented. Failure to do so meant you were guilty not only of owning an unlicensed animal, but also of harbouring a foreign beast, a phrase that made Victorians sound like dramatic characters in a Gothic novel. Working animals had their own set of rules. Horses used for transport, delivery carts, and farm work all required licensing. Inspectors roamed the streets checking horses for proper identification, and if a horse lacked paperwork, its owner was fined. In extreme cases, horses themselves were detained, which must have been confusing for the horse. And then there were the pest animals: rats, ferrets, and snakes, used in questionable forms of Victorian entertainment, such as rat baiting or public displays of snake charming. Authorities, trying desperately to regulate these spectacles, often required performers to license their animals. Imagine showing up at an office with a squirming bag of ferrets, calmly explaining that you needed a permit because you planned to host a rat-catching performance later that afternoon. Victorian attitudes toward animal licensing were shaped by two powerful forces: control, the belief that order required regulation of everything animate or inanimate; suspicion, the fear that unregistered creatures could harbour disease, create disorder, or encourage irresponsible behaviour in humans. And indeed, health concerns played a major role. Rabies outbreaks terrified Victorians to their coal-filled cores, and unlicensed dogs were viewed as biological time bombs. A dog without a collar wasn't just unloved, it was dangerous and stray and possibly demonic, depending on which newspaper you read. But while the laws aimed at public safety, their enforcement often targeted the poor. Wealthy families could easily afford licenses for their dogs, horses, llamas, or whatever exotic creature they acquired abroad. Meanwhile, working-class families struggled to justify a dog tax when they could barely afford bread. As a result, many hid their animals, instructing children to whistle when constables approached so Rover could make a dramatic escape. The saddest cases involve family pets seized due to unpaid taxes. For many working-class children, a beloved dog disappearing into the hands of uniformed officials was a traumatic event. It wasn't simply a bureaucratic matter. It was a loss of companionship in a world with very little comfort to spare. Still, the laws remained rigid. Forgetting your animal's license wasn't a charming mistake. It was evidence of moral weakness. Victorian society believed that responsible citizens documented everything, pets included. An unregistered animal suggested you weren't keeping your household in order, and if you couldn't control your goose, what else couldn't you control? The good news: if you managed to keep your animals licensed and legal, you were considered an exemplary Victorian citizen. The bad news: you still had to explain to authorities why your parrot kept shouting "help," "murder" at random strangers. If you've ever spent a Sunday lounging around, eating snacks, scrolling through your phone and pretending the outside world does not exist, congratulations, you have already committed more Sabbath crimes than a Victorian magistrate could list without needing a glass of water. Because in Victorian Britain, Sunday was not a day of rest. Sunday was a day of mandatory seriousness, tightly supervised piety, and spiritual surveillance so intense it could turn a game of marbles into an act of rebellion. Victorian culture clung fiercely to the belief that Sundays were sacred, and sacred in a very specific way: quiet, obedient, boring. Anything remotely resembling fun was considered an insult to God, civilization, and the local clergy's blood pressure. Let's begin with the basics. Sabbath breaking. Sabbath breaking was a wonderfully elastic offence. It encompassed every activity that wasn't praying, reading religious texts, or staring at a wall while contemplating your moral shortcomings. If you deviated from this holy routine, if you dared engage in earthly behaviour, someone was ready to report you. Victorians believed Sunday was a spiritual battlefield. Angels on one side, temptations on the other, and the temptations were absolutely everywhere. A friendly card game, a whistle, a cheerfully hummed tune, a stroll taken too leisurely, a cricket match, even the irresistible urge to visit a bakery that was technically open. Every one of these was considered a potential gateway to sin. Games, the devil's icebreaker. Playing games on Sunday was morally suspicious. The problem wasn't the game, it was the enjoyment. Victorians distrusted joy on the Sabbath the way modern people distrust emails marked urgent on Fridays. Children playing ball, sinful, adults playing cards, corrupting, a casual, innocent game of hopscotch. Absolutely a sign that someone had failed morally, probably the parents. Authorities didn't just frown upon this, they actively fined it. Inspectors, police, and self-appointed moral guardians patrolled parks looking for the slightest hint of recreation. If they spotted a group tossing a ball, they intervened like referees of righteousness, declaring the match over and everyone involved morally downgraded. Drinking on Sundays drinking was not banned, but enjoying it was. Many pubs either closed or served only travellers, and not people pretending to be travellers, which was apparently a common issue. If a local man strolled in for a pint with suspiciously relaxed body language, the landlord faced penalties. The logic was simple. If you were having fun, you weren't being holy. And if you weren't being holy, you were probably encouraging public collapse. Shopping while sinful shopping on Sundays was seen as one of the worst offences. Victorians believed that buying so much as a turnip on the Sabbath encouraged greed, temptation, commerce and other things that made ministers deeply uncomfortable. Only emergency necessities were acceptable. Bread? Possibly. A shiny new handkerchief? A direct ticket to damnation. Street vendors caught selling fruit, hot potatoes, or sweets risked charges for Sabbath desecration. The irony was that wealthier households often sent servants to fetch forgotten supplies, but because servants were invisible in Victorian logic, this was permissible. Music, songs, and questionable melodies. Victorians were very specific about Sunday music. Hymns, acceptable. Psalms, required. Anything with rhythm, bounce, or earthly delight, illegal or dangerously close. A man caught singing a popular pub tune could be fined for creating unholy amusement. A child whistling was considered Sabbath disorder, and God help you if you played a fiddle. Fiddles were basically contraband on Sundays. Too lively, too spirited, too musical. Authorities feared that one fiddle riff could inspire dancing, and dancing could lead to chaos, and chaos could lead to society crumbling into dust. Work, labour, and the suspiciously busy. While the Industrial Revolution demanded labour non-stop, Victorian morality demanded the opposite on Sundays. Physical work was restricted, and performing it publicly added a layer of scandal. If a blacksmith hammered a horseshoe to help a stranded traveller, he was a saint. If he hammered a horseshoe because someone simply wanted one, sinner. If a woman washed her doorstep, fine. If she washed her laundry, outrageous. The distinctions were so arbitrary you needed divine revelation to interpret them correctly. Travellers versus locals. The traveller exception was one of the most hilariously exploited loopholes of the age. Travellers were permitted certain freedom. They could drink, eat and buy things, presumably because God understood that travel was suffering enough. Predictably, locals began pretending to travel whenever they wanted to break Sabbath rules. People took unnecessary carriage rides or walked in circles until they could plausibly claim to be on a journey. Constables caught on to this. Soon travellers were interrogated about their routes, destinations and intentions. A journey to the bakery. A suspiciously familiar bakery? You live 2 streets over, sir. Denied. The power of public judgment. Even in areas where Sabbath laws weren't heavily enforced by police, they were enforced by neighbours, churches and extended family members, armed with looks that could sour milk. If you hung laundry on Sunday, people whispered. If you laughed too freely, people frowned. If you enjoyed yourself in any visible, audible or spiritual way, someone took notes. Victorian moral oversight was the original neighbourhood watch, except instead of preventing crime, it prevented happiness. Class differences. As usual, class determined enforcement. Wealthy families enjoyed quiet amusements, piano, reading, embroidery, as long as it looked refined. But working-class joy was considered dangerous. Cricket games in poor neighbourhoods were frequently shut down as hotbeds of temptation. Meanwhile, aristocrats threw mild Sunday gatherings and called them social debauchen. Public transport, the battlefield. Sunday transportation existed, but morally, horse-drawn buses moved slower, fewer routes ran, and passengers were expected to sit with the sombre energy of mourners at a very boring funeral. Anyone laughing, chatting, or appearing too relaxed risked comments from fellow travellers. The good news, Victorians took the Sabbath seriously enough to give everyone a day off from the endless grind. The bad news, they also made sure nobody enjoyed it. Victorian Britain adored rules almost as much as it adored alcohol, but only when that alcohol was purchased quickly, consumed properly, and supervised closely by someone wearing an apron. Public houses were meant to serve as respectable community hubs, places where workers unwound and travellers rested. But they were also treated as moral danger zones, sites of temptation, drunkenness, social mischief, and the terrifying possibility that someone might relax too visibly. Which meant the Victorians invented an astonishing legal concept. Being in a pub while not buying anything was a crime. Not drinking was suspicious. Not eating was suspicious. Not doing anything except existing inside the establishment was extremely suspicious. To understand why, you must appreciate the Victorian belief that pubs were magnets for trouble. They were noisy, social, unrestrained, full of people enjoying themselves, essentially everything Victorian authorities spent their lives trying to suppress. As a result, pubs were subjected to intense scrutiny. Every aspect of pub life was regulated: hours, lighting, cleanliness, seating arrangements, and of course the mysterious presence of people who weren't actively buying anything. Let's begin with the central offence: loitering in a public house without intent to purchase. To the Victorian mind, a pub was not a shelter, not a social hub, not a place to gather your thoughts, and certainly not a warm building to escape the cold rain. It was a commercial establishment with strict transactional expectations. If you walked in, you had exactly two tasks: order something, consume it without causing a disturbance. If you deviated from this sacred pattern, the landlord would narrow his eyes, the constable would notice, and everyone else would assume you were up to no good. Why? Because non-buyers were believed to be scoping the room for pickpocketing opportunities, planning drunken chaos, without paying for the privilege, distracting paying customers, avoiding responsibility, harbouring suspicious motives, simply too poor, which in Victorian logic meant too dangerous. The social threat of the non-purchasing pub-goer cannot be overstated. Victorians were convinced that people who entered pubs without money were the root cause of disorder. They feared these individuals would incite fights, steal drinks, beg aggressively, or contaminate the moral fabric of the establishment simply by occupying space without paying rent for it. Thus, landlords were legally obligated to enforce purchase-based presence. Some regions even held landlords criminally responsible if loiterers were found inside their pubs, as though a non-paying customer was a kind of biohazard. Imagine a weary labourer stepping inside to warm his hands by the fire, planning to buy a pint after payday. The landlord sees him, squints suspiciously, and asks the dread question, "Are you intending to order something, sir?" If the man hesitates, perhaps because he was debating whether he could afford a half pint, the landlord might call over a constable. That man could be forcibly removed or, in some cases, fined for the crime of idling in a public house. Idling, in a building literally designed for sitting, gossiping, drinking slowly, and spending hours doing nothing in particular. Victorian logic at its finest. Working-class patrons bore the brunt of these rules. Wealthier customers could linger freely. They were assumed to be considering their options or waiting for company. Meanwhile, anyone in working clothes was presumed guilty unless their coins were already on the counter. If a poor man paused too long before ordering, everyone in the vicinity began evaluating him like a suspicious package. Women faced even stranger consequences. Respectable women rarely visited pubs at all, so if a woman entered and did not immediately order something, with her chaperone present, authorities jumped straight to the worst assumptions. A woman loitering in a pub wasn't merely suspicious, she was scandalous, immoral, and possibly part of a criminal conspiracy to corrupt male patrons with her presence. Meanwhile, travelling workers, porters, sailors, drovers, often ducked into pubs simply for warmth or shelter, especially during London's famously miserable weather. But Victorian Britain didn't care if you were freezing to death. If you weren't buying anything, you were perceived as either a beggar or a thief waiting to select your target. Landlords shooed such men out with broom-like efficiency. The strict enforcement extended to people who used to be customers. Once you finished your drink, you were expected to leave promptly. Remaining at the table after your mug ran dry was suspicious. A pub was not a lounge. It was a place of constant transaction. The idea of nursing a drink was treated with the same disapproval as nursing a dangerous political ideology. Then there was the matter of private rooms. Victorians believed that anyone renting a private room without ordering food or drink was plotting something illicit. Intimacy, gambling, illegal meetings, or worst of all, unmonitored fun. Inspectors frequently checked these rooms to ensure patrons weren't engaging in improper tendencies. Which raises an interesting point. Victorian society was terrified of people doing anything unstructured. Loitering inside a pub violated the sacred Victorian principle that every minute must be accounted for. Pubs were supposed to function like factories for leisure. Enter, buy, consume, depart. If you lingered, you disrupted the system. Authorities justified all this by claiming loitering led to disorder. But the real reason was simpler. Victorians feared idleness. They believed idle people bred crime, immorality, and public nuisance, and nothing embodied idleness more perfectly than a person sitting in a pub, minding their own business, not spending money, not causing trouble, just existing inconveniently. The good news? Buying a pint made you immediately respectable. The bad news? If you didn't buy one fast enough, you were suddenly an existential threat to Victorian society. Victorian Britain took mail very, very seriously. To the modern mind, sending a letter without the correct postage sounds like an inconvenience. A returned envelope, maybe a passive-aggressive sticker. But to the Victorians, it bordered on treason against the entire communication system. Forget to prepay postage in the 19th century, and you didn't just commit a minor mistake. You were participating in the postage reform wars, a national saga of moral panic, bureaucratic fury, and stamp-related drama. To understand why Victorians lost their collective minds over postage, we must go back to the decades before Rowland Hill revolutionised the postal system. In those days, mail was paid upon delivery, meaning the person receiving the letter bore the cost, not the sender. This created no end of chaos. People sent letters to wealthy relatives who then refused to pay. Lovers mailed passionate messages that never reached their intended partners because someone didn't want to part with a shilling. Families communicated by tapping secret dots on the outside of envelopes to avoid paying the actual postage. The system was less communication network and more government-sponsored guessing game. When postage reform finally arrived, requiring senders to prepay postage using stamps, it was heralded as a moment of national enlightenment. Finally, a logical system. A system where those sending the letter paid and those receiving it could stop living in fear of being financially ambushed by the arrival of bad news. Except, because this was Victorian Britain, the reform also came with new ways to criminalise completely ordinary mistakes. The stamp. Your ticket to legality. Once stamps became mandatory, they weren't just adhesives, they were official proof of moral character. If your letter lacked a stamp, you weren't forgetful, you weren't careless, you weren't tragically low on glue. No, you were suspected of fraud evading public duty, scamming the postal service, undermining national order. Possibly being French stamps were treated like tiny bureaucratic passports. Without one, your letter was considered an illegal traveller. The crime of unpaid postage. Sending a letter without the correct stamp, or any stamp at all, could result in fines for both sender and recipient. Recipients who refused to pay the fine risked being labelled uncooperative or suspicious. The letter itself might be detained, interrogated, inspected, or, if its presence deeply offended the clerk, destroyed. Postal clerks loved rules. They were trained to examine envelopes with the confidence of customs officers checking for contraband. An envelope slightly too thick, too light, too oddly shaped, or too creative in its folding might trigger suspicion that someone was evading stamp fees. A notorious example, people folded letters into tiny, intricate shapes to fit into cheaper postage tiers. Clerks responded by unfolding them completely, flattening their artistry and charging full price anyway. In some cases, they accused senders of deliberately cheating the system. Mail fraud. The accidental crime Victorians invented the concept of mail fraud to describe any attempt, intentional or not, to underpay postage. You didn't need a criminal plot. All you needed was the wrong denomination of stamp, a stamp placed in the wrong corner, an address written in confusing handwriting, an envelope that looked overstuffed, or a clerk having a disappointing week. The simplest mistakes were interpreted as cunning strategies to cheat the system. Used a penny stamp for a 2p letter? Fraud. Forgot to lick the stamp properly? Fraud. Stamp fell off in transit? Fraud for you and evidence mishandling for the postman. Some clerks even accused senders of reusing stamps. Reused stamps were the Victorian equivalent of counterfeit money, deeply alarming and punishable by severe fines. Postal staff were trained to inspect stamps for suspicious wear, re-glued corners, or seams indicating tampering. A faded Queen Victoria head could trigger a postal interrogation. Postal interrogations and detainments. Yes, postal interrogations were real. When a suspicious letter arrived, too light for its size, too heavy for its stamp, too mysterious in its appearance, the clerk might summon the intended recipient and quiz them. Do you know this sender? Are you aware this letter is insufficiently stamped? Have you participated in any recent plots to undermine the Royal Mail? Recipients often had no idea what was inside the envelope, but were treated like accomplices in a stamp-related conspiracy. And if the letter's sender could be identified, they faced fines, angry correspondence, or, in severe cases, official warnings. Repeat offenders risked being banned from local post offices until they demonstrated improved understanding of postal obligations. Stamp panic and public fear. Victorians became obsessively careful with stamps. Families kept them in drawers like precious artefacts. Some women sewed tiny stamp pockets into their dresses to ensure they always had one on hand, but God forbid one fell out and stuck to a passerby. That was how stamp disputes began. Children were trained to handle stamps gently, as though they were holding miniature portraits of the Queen, which they literally were. Losing a stamp was a household crisis. Using the wrong stamp was a moral failing. The level of anxiety was so high that etiquette guides included entire sections on correct stamp placement, stamp cleanliness, and the dangers of appearing careless with postage. The role of the postman, national hero, and plant-based detective postman were the enforcers. They did not merely deliver letters, they protected the empire from stamp delinquency. They memorized postage rates, inspected envelopes, sniffed out fraud, and occasionally lectured recipients about proper postal conduct. A good postman was valued, a postman who overlooked an unstamped letter. A disgrace. The good news and the bad news. The good news, prepaid postage made mail accessible to everyone. Letters became a national pastime connecting families, lovers, and business partners across distances once unimaginable. The bad news, if you participated incorrectly or even slightly, the Royal Mail treated you like a stamp-wielding anarchist. Victorian Britain never did moderation well. Victorian Britain loved two things, industry and judgment, and nowhere did those passions collide more aggressively than in its treatment of children. Today, childhood is treated with crayons, nap time, and eating snacks shaped like cartoon animals. In Victorian Britain, childhood meant labour, discipline, and being regarded with the same suspicion one might reserve for a raccoon, rummaging in the pantry. If you were a child who wasn't working hard enough, or dare we say skipped work or school, congratulations, you are now a miniature delinquent. Victorians believed that idleness was the root of all evil, and children with their natural inclination toward laughter, curiosity, and occasionally thinking about things other than productivity were seen as dangerously prone to idleness. A child with free time was a child who might start wandering, daydreaming, or having fun. Activities Victorian reformers regarded as stepping stones toward total moral collapse. Let's start with the workplace. Victorian children worked everywhere. Factories, mines, laundries, farms, fisheries, shops, brickyards, basically anywhere that required bodies small enough to fit under machinery or into spaces that were, by design, hazardous. Their jobs included sweeping chimneys, operating looms, picking stones from under machinery, and other tasks that sound more like plot points in tragic novels than official job descriptions. Employers expected punctuality, precision, and obedience. A child who arrived late could be fined. A child who worked slowly could be punished. A child who dared pause to rest their aching limbs could be scolded for lacking industry. Victorians had the astonishing ability to look at an exhausted, soot-covered 8-year-old and conclude that the problem wasn't the 14-hour shift, it was the child's insufficient dedication. Skipping work, even for valid reasons like illness, injury, exhaustion, or being a literal child, was treated as a personal failing. Some employers docked wages, Some fired the child instantly, others reported truancy to local authorities, claiming the child was showing tendencies toward vagrancy, which essentially meant this child stopped moving for 10 seconds and we don't trust it. Parish officials, schoolmasters, and factory overseers worked together like a multi-department crime task force targeting children whose greatest crime was wanting a moment of rest. And then there was school. For much of the Victorian era, school attendance wasn't universally mandatory, but once compulsory education laws emerged, truancy became a moral panic so intense you'd think the empire's stability depended on whether Timmy attended spelling class. Victorians worried that uneducated children would become street Arabs, the era's incredibly insensitive term for homeless, wandering children supposedly destined for crime. Schools employed attendance officers, unofficially known as the board men, who roamed neighbourhoods hunting down children who were skipping school. These men were part detective, part disciplinarian, and part nightmare for any child hiding behind a tree hoping to avoid arithmetic. If they caught you, off you marched back to school, with all the solemnity of a prisoner being escorted to trial. Parents, too, could be punished for their children's truancy. Authorities believed that if a child skipped school, the parent had committed a moral failure. Some families were fined, others were warned sternly. Some faced home inspections under the assumption that poor domestic discipline was a sign of deeper deficiency. Victorian schoolmasters kept detailed attendance logs, books filled with names, dates, and red marks like a bureaucratic horror novel. Children who missed too many days were labelled habitually absent, and once branded, this status followed them with the persistence of a minor curse. Future employers might treat it as a sign of weak character. So what counted as truancy? Victorians had an impressively broad definition: staying home to help with chores, truancy, helping a sick sibling, truancy, oversleeping because you worked until midnight the previous day, truancy, avoiding school because the teacher was terrifying common, truancy, skipping because you hated long division, definitely truancy, being late due to having only one pair of shoes shared between siblings, also truancy. If you were a working-class child, school was not a gentle place. It involved rigid discipline, memorization drills, stiff benches, and teachers armed with a biblical understanding of corporal punishment. Yet skipping was still interpreted as an act of rebellion. Authorities believed truant children were at risk of joining the criminal underworld. What exactly was this criminal underworld? According to Victorian thinkers, it consisted of street performers, petty thieves, beggars, chimney sweeps who weren't attached to a master, and essentially anyone who existed outdoors during daylight hours without a hat. These dire assumptions led to institutions called industrial schools and reformatory schools, places designed to correct the behaviour of unruly children. Being sent there didn't necessarily mean you'd committed a crime, only that someone believed you might someday. Industrial schools taught trades and discipline. Reformatories taught discipline and discipline. Both were, in essence, child-sized correctional facilities. Some children entered these institutions not because of crimes, but because they were orphans, poor, homeless, or simply inconvenient. Society genuinely believed that disciplining children early would prevent future misdeeds. The idea that children might need rest, affection, or time to grow was considered suspiciously indulgent. And let's not forget the terrifying Victorian assumption that boredom was a warning sign. If a child looked bored, it meant their mind was idle, and an idle mind was a danger. Victorian adults responded to bored children the way modern adults respond to smoke alarms, immediately and with disproportionate urgency. The good news? If you were a Victorian child who worked tirelessly and attended school without fail, you were considered morally upright. The bad news? You were also exhausted, stressed, and treated like a tiny adult with a full-time job and no labour rights. Victorian Britain had an astonishing talent for transforming the ordinary inconveniences of city life into full-blown legal crises, especially when those inconveniences occurred anywhere in the vicinity of a gentleman. If a wealthy Victorian man so much as suspected that a sound, smell, sight or breeze was not perfectly tailored to his comfort, the law was on his side. And thus was born the era's most delightfully absurd legal category, the nuisance. This was not a minor complaint. In Victorian Britain, a nuisance was a quasi-criminal offence. And what fell under this category? Oh, everything. A child's laughter, a neighbour's cooking, a street musician's tune, laundry dancing cheerfully in the wind, a smell that hinted vaguely at cabbage, a voice raised slightly above polite whisper, footsteps that dared to sound mortal. All of these could send a gentleman into a spiral of indignation so profound he might pen a letter to the authorities on parchment thick enough to double as armour plating. Let's start with noise, the Victorian gentleman's greatest enemy. Noise to him was not merely unpleasant, it was a moral affront. He believed that wealthy neighbourhoods should be bastions of serene respectability, free from the barbaric racket produced by workers, children, animals, musicians, or anyone breathing too enthusiastically. A single street organ, the beloved instrument of cheerful chaos, could drive him to the brink of emotional collapse. Organ grinders were especially hated. Victorians described their music as auditory terrorism, a phrase that might feel dramatic until you recall that these same Victorians thought wallpaper could poison you. Wealthy households frequently summoned police to remove street musicians from earshot. In London, some districts basically declared war on them. Even worse offenders were children. Children playing hopscotch? Nuisance. Children shrieking with delight? Nuisance. Children bouncing a ball? The worst kind of nuisance, one that suggested joy. Wealthy Victorians treated the sound of children enjoying themselves as unnatural, like a sign that society was unravelling. A gentleman opening his window only to hear a group of children chanting a skipping rhyme often reacted as though he'd caught someone stealing his silverware. Then there were smells. Smells were dangerous in Victorian Britain. They weren't just unpleasant, they were considered a sign of disease, poverty, or moral decay. A whiff of stew drifting over a garden wall could trigger a complaint. A faint fishy scent from a street vendor could prompt a police visit. But nothing outraged wealthy noses more than the aroma of working-class laundry. Clothes boiling in soap and water created steam that carried odours that drifted into genteel airspace. Thus laundry hanging to dry near wealthy homes could be declared a public offence. Clotheslines were considered unsightly and unhygienic, despite the fact that Victorian households themselves produced more smells than the Thames on a hot day. Poor families hanging laundry near respectable windows risked fines, warnings, or neighbourhood fury. Some wealthy districts managed to get local ordinances passed forbidding outdoor laundry entirely. Air-drying clothing, the most practical method available, was rebranded as airborne nuisance. Cooking smells were also suspicious. Working-class families lived in cramped quarters where cooking happened inches from windows, often releasing aromas of onions, fish, cabbage, stews, and affordable cuts of meat. These scents drifted into wealthy enclaves, causing mortification. Newspapers complained about the pungency of the lower orders, as though poor families were deliberately weaponizing vegetables. But nothing compared to the moral panic caused by music. Public music, especially lively, joyful, or rhythmic music, was treated as a direct attack on upper-class serenity. A violin played on the street, begging, a harmonica, disturbance of public order, a man singing while walking past a gentleman's home, outrageous, indecent, and likely punishable. Some gentlemen demanded special quiet zones near their homes, insisting that any sound louder than their own heartbeat be removed by force if necessary. And then, of course, there was the crime of simply existing too close to a gentleman's line of sight. Working-class families often lived in narrow alleys or back courts behind affluent homes. Their windows faced each other, creating opportunities for the rich to witness horrifying scenes such as a family eating dinner, a woman scrubbing a pot, children doing chores, someone sitting down without a corset. These sights disturbed the Victorian fantasy that the lower classes existed only in the shadows. It was a common complaint among wealthy residents that working-class households were visible from the rear windows, which was treated as an architectural sin, as though poor families should have arranged themselves underground to avoid casting visual offence. Gentlemen also despised street vendors who dared approach their neighbourhoods. They viewed vendors as noisy, disorderly intruders, even though these vendors were simply trying to survive. A woman selling flowers too close to an elite townhouse could be shooed away by police. A man selling hot chestnuts could be declared a vendor of nuisance materials, simply because the smell of roasted nuts drifted toward respectable noses. And God forbid a working-class family kept animals near a gentleman's home. Even harmless creatures, like chickens, songbirds, or a friendly goat, were considered disturbances. A goat bleating in the morning? Outrageous. A rooster crowing? Criminal. The poor might rely on animals for eggs, milk, or income, but the wealthy relied on uninterrupted silence. The irony, of course, was that wealthy households produced their own nuisances. Their servants clattered in kitchens, their horses thundered along the streets, their carriages rattled windows, their dinner parties spilled noise into the night. But Victorian logic dictated that upper-class noises were civilization, while lower-class noises were chaos. The good news: avoiding nuisance accusations near a gentleman's home meant you learned to live silently and invisibly, much like a polite spectre. The bad news: nobody told the children, the animals, or the cabbage stew. Books could be seized for immorality, indecency, sedition, or inciting unladylike thoughts. Even science books sometimes caused trouble. Victorian Britain adored books, but only the right books, the wrong books. On the other hand, were treated like dangerous explosives, liable to detonate the moral fabric of civilization if opened by the wrong pair of hands. A book could elevate your mind, ruin your reputation, or get you hauled into court faster than you could say improper literature. Reading wasn't merely a pastime, it was a legally monitored activity. At the heart of the Victorian reading panic was the belief that printed words had extraordinary power. Books did not simply contain ideas, they transmitted them like moral diseases. If you read a bad book, Victorians feared you might begin thinking bad thoughts. And once a single bad thought entered your mind, you might start having emotions, opinions, or, in the worst-case scenario, ambitions. Let's begin with the crime of immoral literature. This category was so massive it might as well have included any book that caused a raised eyebrow. Religious leaders, social reformers, and moral guardians all believed that dangerous books lurked in every shadowy corner, ready to corrupt innocent readers. Immorality could mean anything from sensual content, scandalous, to humour that was a little too bold, chaotic, to themes that implied life wasn't a perfectly polished moral lesson, incomprehensible. Novels aimed at women were especially scrutinised. If a book depicted a heroine with too much independence, too much intelligence, or too much freedom to breathe unchaperoned, critics declared it pernicious. A young lady reading such a novel might begin imagining life outside her parlour. She might even form opinions, and once opinions formed, a woman was one bookmark away from rebellion. Police raids on bookshops were not uncommon. Inspectors seized material they deemed indecent. Pamphlets, foreign novels, scientific texts, French poetry, all was suspicious. And anything published outside Britain's moral jurisdiction, which was basically everywhere. Entire shipments of books were confiscated simply because someone decided the titles looked improper. A book called The Physiology of Human Nature? Contraband. A book titled On the Human Form? Absolutely immoral. A book titled Botanical Studies for Young Ladies? Potentially seditious if the flowers looked too expressive. Yes, even science books were trouble. As scientific understanding grew, so did Victorian anxiety. Books explaining evolution, geology, astronomy, or human biology were treated like intellectual TNT. Darwin's ideas didn't just challenge religious beliefs. They threatened to unravel the comforting Victorian notion that everything had a neat, divinely approved explanation. If you read the wrong scientific text, Victorians feared your mind might break loose from tradition, galloping wildly through the meadows of rational thought. Sedition was another major category of forbidden reading. Books criticising the government, even gently, could be banned for inciting unrest. Criticism wasn't patriotism, it was treasonous boldness. Pamphlets that argued for workers' rights were considered radical. Books advocating political reform were suspicious. Anything written by a foreign radical, particularly a French or German one, was treated with the same alarm as a contagious plague. Then there were books banned for strange reasons, books containing ghosts, magic, spiritualism, or unusual ideas. Victorians adored seances but distrusted supernatural fiction. A story suggesting ghosts might intervene in the living world could be accused of disrupting the moral compass of youth. Meanwhile, books too grounded in realism could be banned for excessive frankness. It was a narrow, impossible path. Too imaginary, bad. Too realistic, worse. Working-class readers faced the harshest scrutiny. Authorities believed they were especially vulnerable to corruption, so cheap novels, serialised fiction, and penny dreadfuls were frequently targeted. The fear was absurd. If a man read a cheap thriller where a villain escaped prison, he might get ideas. If a child read about pirates, she might decide to leave home and sail the seas, which, honestly, sounds more fun than factory work. If a teenage boy read a love story, authorities panicked as if he'd been handed a lit torch in a fireworks factory. Women reading politically charged books were considered especially dangerous. A woman who read too much might begin questioning domestic expectations. If she read about women elsewhere earning rights or pursuing education, she might imitate them. That would be catastrophic. Imagine a woman insisting on choosing her own friends, her own books, or, heaven forbid, her own husband. Booksellers walked a tightrope, stock the wrong book and risk police raids. Stock only approved books and go broke. Some secretly hid controversial titles under the counter, passing them to trusted customers like contraband. Buying a forbidden book often involved coded language. Do you have the special edition? Something more advanced? The book with the ideas? You weren't buying literature. You were performing espionage. The good news? Many Victorians read passionately, boldly, and rebelliously, pushing society toward progress. The bad news? Owning the wrong paperback could instantly turn you into a suspicious intellectual menace. Public health inspectors could fine you for a filthy home, or accuse you of concealing sickness if it was suspiciously spotless. Victorian Britain was obsessed with hygiene, but in the same contradictory way it was obsessed with everything else. To be healthy was good, to be dirty was bad, but to be too clean? Suspicious. Very suspicious. Enter the era's most confusing crime, maintaining a household that was either disgustingly filthy or alarmingly clean. Victorians wanted you to hit the exact middle ground, a mystical level of acceptability known only to health inspectors and possibly divine beings. Let's begin with filth. Working-class homes often struggled with cleanliness, not for lack of effort, but because many families lived in cramped, damp, overcrowded conditions with limited access to clean water. Public health inspectors roamed the streets like sanitary detectives, barging into homes unannounced to evaluate cleanliness. If they found too much dirt, too many insects, or too many unpleasant smells, penalties followed, fines, warnings, sermons about morality, and accusations of endangering the neighbourhood. Victorians believed filth wasn't just unhygienic, it was immoral. Dirt meant disorder. Disorder meant sin. A layer of grime wasn't merely grime, it was a moral failing visible on every surface. But here's the twist. If your home was too clean, you were also in trouble. Inspectors suspected you were hiding something, sickness, contagion, or morally questionable behaviour. A house scrubbed to the point of sparkling could mean you had recently concealed evidence of illness. You were performing an unnatural level of effort, suspicious. You were pretending to be more respectable than your social class allowed. You were possibly planning to move up in society, even more suspicious. Yes, upward mobility triggered sanitary investigations, a perfectly arranged kitchen. Concealment? A spotless floor? Cover-up, freshly laundered linens folded neatly, impossible unless something sinister was afoot. Victorian inspectors were like paradox machines. A dusty table meant you were cultivating disease. A perfectly polished table meant artificial presentation. Victorian households could not win. Their standards were also contradictory. Inspectors demanded open windows for ventilation, yet complained when homes became too cold. They wanted floors scrubbed, but insisted on minimal water usage. They praised sunlight, but insisted curtains remain closed to prevent immodesty. They wanted homes tidy, but too much tidiness was pretension. Disease outbreaks made everything worse. If someone caught smallpox, cholera, or typhus, the entire home was examined. Families were warned not to exaggerate symptoms, but if they minimized symptoms or cleaned too effectively, they were accused of concealing sickness, a charge as dramatic as it was vague. Wealthy families were often exempt from scrutiny, as usual. Their grand homes were expected to be pristine, but working families were monitored ruthlessly. Inspectors believed poverty naturally produced dirt, so any poor household suspiciously free of grime was accused of artifices of cleanliness, a phrase that sounds like a magic trick performed with soap. The good news? You could avoid punishment by achieving the perfect balance of cleanliness. The bad news? That balance didn't exist. Throwing waste anywhere except designated, horribly maintained areas could lead to fines. Even dropping a potato peel incorrectly could qualify. Victorian Britain had a complicated relationship with waste. The streets overflowed with filth. Sewage flowed through open channels and refuse piled up in alleys. But somehow you could still be fined for putting garbage in the wrong place. The empire may not have mastered sanitation, but it mastered punishing people for sanitation mistakes. The rules were simple. Waste had to go into designated areas. The problem? Those areas were disasters. Overflowing pits, leaking bins, rat kingdoms, sludge ponds of questionable origin. Using them correctly required courage, aim, and a tetanus-proof constitution, but using them incorrectly, that was a punishable offence. Victorian authorities were obsessed with maintaining public order, visually at least. If rubbish was in the right place, they ignored it. If rubbish was in the wrong place, say 3 inches to the left, you were treated like an environmental criminal. Let's explore the crimes. Throwing vegetable scraps on the street could result in fines. Officials feared potato peels would encourage vermin, create slippery hazards, or invite the working classes to gather around and gawk. Apparently this happened. Housewives caught tossing cabbage leaves out their back doors were reprimanded like mischievous schoolchildren. Dumping dirty water improperly was another offence. Many homes had no indoor plumbing, so families emptied wash water into public drains or nearest available street corner. Inspectors monitored this with zeal. If you emptied water outside regulation hours, or if your water splashed across a gentleman's shoe, consequences followed. Ash disposal was also regulated. Coal fires produced mountains of ash, and disposing of it required precision. Spill even a handful outside the official ash bin, and neighbours gasped as though you'd committed arson. Food sellers were frequently targeted. The peelings, shells, bones, and scraps left after selling goods needed precise disposal. A fishmonger who left a single tail fin in the gutter could be fined. Vendors complained that rats moved faster than they did. But the inspectors never cited the rats. The worst? Chamber pot disposal. Morning emptyings were restricted. If you dumped your night's accumulation too early or too late, or if the wind carried the scent toward a respectable window, you could face penalties. Imagine trying to follow waste disposal regulations while holding a pot of emotional trauma. Even animals weren't excused. If your horse left manure in the road, you were responsible for removing it promptly. This often meant dismounting immediately, scooping by hand and depositing it in the nearest pile. Failure to perform this ritual turned you into a manure delinquent. But perhaps the most Victorian offence was improper rubbish stacking. Some towns enforced rules on how high you could pile waste before collection. Too low? Unsanitary. Too high? Disorderly. any leaning, sagging, or aesthetically displeasing angles of trash architecture. Nuisance laws activated. Yet ironically, the city's official dumps were often worse than the infractions. Rats flourished, piles smouldered, sludge leaked, but because the waste was correctly located, officials declared it under control. Why were the laws so strict? 3 reasons. Fear of disease, Victorians blamed bad smells for illness. Fear of disorder, waste suggested chaos, and chaos terrified the middle class. Fear of the poor, waste disposal crimes disproportionately targeted working families living in overcrowded districts. The good news? If you mastered Victorian waste etiquette, you could avoid fines. The bad news? You were still dumping chamber pots into open drains. Victorian Britain adored appearances. Clean facades, quiet streets, orderly queues, symmetrical shrubs, and citizens who behaved as predictably as well-oiled machines. Anything that disrupted this visual harmony, anything that reminded society that life was messy, unpredictable and human, was treated as a problem. And few things disrupted Victorian ideals more than the public visibility of disability or mental illness. So the Victorians did what they always did when faced with something they didn't understand. They criminalised it. To be disabled in Victorian Britain was to exist under suspicion, not because you'd done anything wrong, but because you failed to blend seamlessly into a society obsessed with uniformity. A limp, a tremor, a visible injury, or even an unusual gait could prompt intrusive questions, stares, or outright intervention from authorities. If your body moved differently, or your mind worked differently, you were labelled a disturbance, an obstruction, a public spectacle, or, most cruelly, a nuisance. Let's begin with mobility disabilities. Victorians believed the streets belonged to the able, the swift, and the silently respectable. Someone walking with a crutch or cane in a crowded area was seen not as a person managing difficulty, but as an obstacle to traffic flow, a human roadblock. Authorities could legally remove disabled people from busy thoroughfares if they believed their presence impeded movement. The logic was absurd. The very city designed without ramps, handrails, or accessible pathways blamed disabled people for not moving gracefully enough through its hostility. And then there were amputees, particularly veterans. You'd think a nation that celebrated military heroism would treat wounded veterans with respect. Unfortunately, Victorian admiration stopped the moment a wounded soldier needed financial assistance or dared to appear in public. Many disabled veterans turned to street begging because pensions were inadequate or non-existent. But begging, in Victorian logic, was classified as a form of vagrancy, which was criminal. So men wounded in war could be fined or arrested for attempting to survive. Mental illness was treated even more harshly. Victorians viewed mental illness not as a medical issue, but as a threat to moral order. A person speaking to themselves, pacing unpredictably, or showing signs of distress could be detained under a broad and terrifying category known as lunacy in public. No diagnosis required, no medical evidence needed. A constable simply had to decide that you looked mad and you could be taken away. Sometimes madness meant muttering. Sometimes it meant crying too freely. Sometimes it meant staring at a wall for an uncomfortably long period. Anything that deviated from Victorian emotional stiffness, anything that demonstrated too much or too little feeling was suspect. People experiencing hallucinations or delusions were treated with cruelty bordering on the theatrical. Instead of receiving care, they were mocked, avoided, or marched straight to an institution. Victorians considered asylums moral warehouses, places to store those who didn't fit neatly into society's decorative boxes. And if someone with mental illness wandered the streets, oh dear, wandering was already illegal if you were poor, young, or simply too relaxed. Wandering while mentally ill was considered doubly sinful, a threat to yourself, a threat to others, and most importantly a threat to the illusion that Victorian society was in perfect control of itself. People with cognitive disabilities or neurodivergent traits were treated with similar suspicion. if someone behaved in a way that seemed unusual, if they repeated phrases, rocked back and forth, avoided eye contact, or became overwhelmed, Victorians didn't interpret this as a neurological difference. They interpreted it as disorder, disturbance, deviance. Even epilepsy was misunderstood. A person having a seizure in public might be accused of drunkenness, demonic influence, or moral failure. Seizures frightened bystanders, and frightened bystanders called the police. Imagine regaining consciousness after a seizure only to find yourself accused of improper behaviour or unlicensed street performance. Deaf and blind individuals faced their own challenges. Many worked as musicians or vendors, but if they were too successful or drew a crowd, authorities accused them of begging illegally. If they moved slowly, they were a nuisance. If they moved confidently, they were disguising their true condition, which Victorians considered suspicious. The absurdity didn't end there. Families with disabled members were often pressured to keep them indoors, ostensibly for safety, but really to preserve the neighbourhood's aesthetic purity. A disabled child playing outside invited judgment. A mentally ill adult sitting on a front step could trigger complaints from neighbours who insisted such spectacles reduced property values. In extreme cases, families hid disabled relatives entirely, not because they were ashamed, but because authorities might seize the person and place them in an institution for their own good. Victorian institutions, however, were overcrowded, underfunded, and proudly indifferent to human comfort. Patients were housed with little regard to diagnosis, often spending their lives among strangers who shared nothing but society's fear. People with mental illness in public were also accused of causing moral contamination. Victorians believed that improper behaviour, especially unpredictable behaviour, spread like a contagion. Seeing a distressed person might prompt others to feel distress, and distress was a disorder, and disorder was a crime. The good news? A few reformers recognised the cruelty and fought for better care. The bad news? Most Victorians believed disability and mental illness were problems best kept out of sight, by law, by force, or by social pressure. To exist differently in Victorian Britain was to risk accusation simply for being visible, and to be visible was to be vulnerable. Victorian Britain loved industry. It loved factories, machines, clanging metal, puffing chimneys, and the reassuring thunder of progress echoing across the empire. But what Victorians did not love, paradoxically, was noise. Noise was suspicious, noise was disruptive, and noise that came from people simply trying to do their jobs, that was downright criminal. Chapter 22 brings us into the wonderfully absurd world where blacksmiths, carpenters, wheelwrights, knife sharpeners, cobblers, street musicians, and nearly every other working soul could be fined for the mere act of existing loudly. Victorians wanted a productive society, yes, but preferably one that didn't make a sound. Let's begin with the blacksmith, the unlucky mascot of industrial noise. You would think a blacksmith's hammer-striking anvil, the heartbeat of any town, would be considered essential. And it was, until the moment a gentleman moved into the neighbourhood and decided that productivity was no longer charming. Blacksmiths were fined for hammering too early, too late, too enthusiastically, or too metallically. Imagine being penalised because the sound of metal on metal was judged as too metallic. Blacksmiths responded by hanging signs like "working hours" and "quiet for the neighbours," which must have been equal parts ironic and infuriating. The job literally required hammering in rhythmic violence, yet society wanted it done at the volume of a polite cough. Next on the chopping block, carpenters. Carpenters were scolded for sawing too loudly, planing too loudly, sanding too loudly. Customers wanted new furniture, but did not want to hear the uncomfortable truth that furniture making involved tools, wood, and friction. A carpenter could be fined for operating outside designated quiet windows, which made it sound as though he worked with explosives instead of timber. Victorian ordinances sometimes restricted sawing during sensitive hours, which surprisingly included breakfast time, tea time, post-tea time, late afternoon, digestion time, any time a neighbour was feeling fragile, Essentially, carpenters were allowed to make noise only during that mystical 5-minute interval when no one was complaining. And then there were the wheelwrights, whose job involved shaping wood, hammering rims and testing wheels. Wheels, tragically, are notoriously noisy things when being constructed. A wheelwright tapping a rim could apparently shake the moral foundations of an entire street. Watchmen patrolled neighbourhoods to make sure wheel-making stayed within acceptable decibel levels, which was odd considering the same neighbourhoods echoed daily with the much louder sound of horse hooves and carriage wheels. But the workers who got the worst of it were street musicians. Victorians loved music in theory, harps in parlours, violins at soirees, pianos politely tinkling under candlelight. They just didn't want that music performed by actual musicians in actual streets where actual people lived. The sight of a hard-working man playing a hurdy-gurdy or violin for coins triggered Victorian outrage on multiple levels. It was noise, it was public, it was joyful, it encouraged crowds. It reminded everyone that poor people had hobbies. Authorities fined street musicians under the charge of industrial noise, which was a fancy phrase for "your tune has annoyed a gentleman." Organ grinders were practically hunted. Their cheerful melodies were considered auditory chaos that could rattle aristocratic nerves like thunder in a teacup. One report complained that street musicians caused violent discomfort to sensitive people. Violent discomfort from a melody played on an accordion. Knife grinders, equally cursed, produced sparks and grinding noises that could be heard half a street away on a windy day. Their work was essential. People needed sharp knives to cook, butcher, farm and defend themselves from Victorian pigeons, but their grinding wheels were seen as sonic threats. Knife grinders often had to relocate multiple times a day, chased off by constables enforcing auditory peace. And don't forget the cobblers. Cobblers hammered soles, tapped heels and stitched leather, activities rich in tiny percussion that echoed through thin Victorian walls. Neighbours frequently reported cobblers for persistent tapping, as though cobblers were performing a rebellious tap dance routine instead of trying to fix someone's boots. Even market sellers faced accusations. The calls of fishmongers, butchers and vegetable vendors, traditional street cries, were deemed noise pollution if they reached the ears of someone important enough to complain. The very concept of shouting fresh mackerel was treated as a public disturbance unless performed at exactly the correct volume and musical pitch. Ironworkers, criminally loud, stonecutters, practically detonating the city. Bell ringers, a menace unless rung inside a church and for the morally appropriate purpose of summoning everyone to sit still and be judged. And let's talk about the hypocrisy. Victorian cities were not quiet. They were packed with steam engines, clanging trams, factory whistles, carts rattling on cobblestones, livestock bawling, street hawkers, construction sites, drunken opera, sung by sailors at 1 a.m. Yet somehow the blame always fell on whichever poor soul's livelihood relied on producing noise. Society wanted work done silently, efficiently and invisibly, preferably with the worker vanishing like a Victorian ninja once his task was complete. Some towns even created quiet zones near upscale residences. No hammering, no music, no tool use, no shouting, no loading carts, no unloading carts, no existence that wasn't whisper soft. Tradespeople responded by conducting work covertly, sneaking tools around, and performing silent hours where they did everything except the part of their job that generated income. The good news? Making noise meant you were contributing to society. The bad news? Society thanked you by fining you for acoustic enthusiasm. Victorian Britain maintained the astonishing belief that the entire empire could collapse if two people accidentally brushed fingertips in public. In a society obsessed with propriety, the human body, its gestures, glances, and innocent collisions, was viewed as a barely contained scandal. And so Victorian authorities, moral guardians, and extremely enthusiastic busybodies developed elaborate rules about touching, flirting, and even looking. Let's begin with the crime of improper touching, one of the Victorians' most flexible legal categories. It covered everything from a deliberate hand squeeze to the accidental graze of an elbow while boarding a train. If two people so much as bumped into each other and a witness misinterpreted it, congratulations, you had just performed a public indecency. Victorian law didn't require intent. Intent was irrelevant. What mattered was appearance. If it looked improper, it was improper. The concept of giving the benefit of the doubt was considered far too modern and possibly dangerous. For example, imagine you're in a crowded omnibus, jostled by every pothole in London. You reach out to steady yourself, accidentally touch someone's coat sleeve, and instantly become a person of interest in the ongoing Victorian investigation of public morality. Someone might glare, someone might whisper, someone might tell a constable that you seemed overly familiar in your movements, a phrase that encompassed everything from deliberate contact to existing with limbs. But it wasn't only touch that was criminalized. Flirting itself was a battlefield of suspicion. Victorian flirting was such a delicate art that modern courtship would look like barbarism by comparison. For Victorians, flirtation involved a glance held 2 seconds too long, a smile delivered at the wrong angle, a greeting spoken with too much warmth, or the mortal sin of casually adjusting one's hair in someone's direction. Authorities, and by authorities, we often mean anyone with a parasol newspaper or moral superiority complex, believed improper flirtation was the gateway drug to societal ruin. A woman who smiled too boldly risked being labelled forward, a word that in Victorian English roughly translated to practically a criminal mastermind. A man who complimented a lady without a chaperone present could be accused of making improper advances. Victorian etiquette guides dedicated entire chapters to warning young women about the dangers of being too charming. Advice included: avoid prolonged eye contact unless engaged or married. Do not smile more than twice in public. Never giggle. Giggles are suspect. Keep your gaze lowered at all times. Looking up is interpreted as invitation. It's a miracle anyone dated at all, but perhaps the most absurd legal dangers came from looking, specifically the crime of impertinent staring. If a man gazed at a woman for too long, he could be confronted as a moral offender. If a woman gazed at a man for too long, she was socially crucified, rumoured about for months, and possibly accused of attempting seduction, an offence punishable by the reputation death. People walked the streets avoiding eye contact like trained covert operatives. A man strolling past a woman might look at a lamppost, a window, a passing dog, the sky. Anything to avoid the catastrophic risk of being accused of suggestive gazing. Women perfected the downward glance, a technique that required impressive neck control and constant awareness of cobblestones. Couples faced even stricter scrutiny. Public affection, no matter how mild, was considered shocking. Holding hands, indecent, standing too close, improper. Whispering, scandalous, sharing an umbrella, positively sinful, unless the umbrella was very large and both parties maintained a distance of at least one Victorian moral unit, roughly 12 inches. There were documented cases where couples were fined for embracing unlawfully, which could mean anything from a brief hug to leaning toward one another in a way that suggested possible future hugging. Even married couples weren't immune. In public, they were expected to behave like two people who had only just been introduced at a funeral. A husband offering his wife his arm was acceptable. Anything more affectionate, like placing a hand on her back or whispering in her ear, could provoke scandalized murmurs from passers-by. It wasn't simply modesty. Victorians believed public morality was delicate, easily influenced by example. If one couple openly displayed affection, others might copy them. And if affection spread, society would crumble into anarchy, unregulated emotions, and dangerously cheerful behaviour. Of course, the enforcement of these moral codes was deeply inconsistent and wildly biased. The wealthy were afforded leeway. Lovers strolling through Hyde Park might get away with a conspiratorial smile. Meanwhile, working-class couples risked accusations for behaviours that were nearly invisible. If a factory girl and a dock worker stood too closely under a lamppost, a constable might break them apart like a moral crowbar. Women bore the worst consequences. A woman accused of inviting advances, or responding to them, could face ruin. Men were chastised, women were condemned. A single misinterpreted gesture could destroy her marriage prospects, employment, or social safety. Victorian society excelled at turning women's normal behaviour into dramatic scandal. Then there were the accidental crimes. A man helping a woman step over a puddle could be accused of taking liberties. A woman brushing past a man on a narrow street risked being labelled forward. Two strangers reaching for the same dropped object could trigger whispers. Even the wind posed legal danger. If a breeze lifted a woman's shawl or skirt for half a second, men were expected to look away instantly or else risk accusations of indecency. A simple gust of wind could therefore generate half a dozen moral infractions. Victorian moral policing wasn't just about public behaviour, it was about protecting a national fantasy. Society clung to the belief that respectable people didn't have bodies, didn't experience attraction, and certainly never touched anyone outside a fully notarized marital arrangement. The good news, if you mastered the art of not touching, not looking, and not emoting, you remained safe. The bad news, you had to navigate public life as though participating in a competitive sport of emotional origami. Victorian Britain did not simply criminalise poverty, noise, emotions, and existence. It also generated an extraordinary category of offences so peculiar, so creatively absurd that modern readers often assume they must be jokes. But no, these were real charges, recorded in newspapers, court logs, and local magistrates' reports. The Victorians were so determined to police society that they invented crimes where none logically existed. Our final chapter, therefore, celebrates the crown jewels of Victorian weirdness, the offences that sound like Monty Python sketches, but were utterly, terrifyingly legitimate. Let's begin with one of the era's most confusing allegations: suspicious loaf carrying. Yes, carrying bread was cause for arrest. If a person, particularly someone poor, was seen walking with a loaf of bread that appeared too fresh, too large, too nice, too crusty, or too far from any obvious bakery, authorities assumed theft. Simply possessing baked goods became a moral emergency. Imagine walking home with groceries and having a constable interrogate you like a carb-loving detective. "Where did you obtain that loaf, sir? Is it truly your loaf, madam? Why does it look so recently baked?" Bread was evidence, bread was motive. Bread was basically the Victorian equivalent of a suspicious briefcase. Next is the unforgettable charge of malicious vegetable throwing. Throwing vegetables wasn't merely rude. It was a criminal act. Magistrates' records include cases of people being fined for hurling turnips, carrots, onions, potatoes, and once famously a cabbage described as unusually firm. This wasn't limited to pub fights. Children throwing rotten vegetables at each other? Crime. Adults tossing a potato across a market stall? Crime. A food vendor flinging an unwanted beet into a bin slightly too forcefully? Also crime if witnessed by a sufficiently dramatic neighbour. Victorians genuinely feared vegetables in motion, perhaps because produce was often used as ammunition in street disputes, political protests, or theatre heckling. One theatrical riot featured so many airborne onions that the newspapers described the stage as resembling a battle in a greengrocer's nightmare. Carrots, apparently, were especially dangerous, sharp, aerodynamic, and capable of striking someone important. Now let's examine one of the most beloved absurdities, being found drunk in charge of a cow. The law against drunken livestock supervision was extremely real. If you were responsible for guiding, herding, transporting, or otherwise supervising a cow while intoxicated, you could be arrested. This law applied to cows, horses, pigs, donkeys, goats, and occasionally aggressive geese. The logic was sound enough. Drunk people shouldn't be controlling 1,000-pound animals, but Victorian courts took it to Shakespearean extremes. Cases include a farmer fined for staggering while leading a melancholy cow, a milkman punished for inebriated milking, a man arrested after attempting to ride his cow home in the manner of a gentleman upon a horse. Apparently the cow did not approve. Another delightful offence was pretending to conjure spirits for money, which was treated as fraud, witchcraft, and entertainment tax evasion all at once. Spiritualism was popular, but unlicensed spiritual trickery was dangerous. A man arrested for improper séance conduct protested that he was only pretending to speak for ghosts, not actually summoning them. Authorities found this even worse. In the same category comes fortune-telling without a license. Reading palms, crime. Reading tea leaves, crime. Reading the future based on the shape of someone's hat. Possibly innovative, but still crime. Victorian fortune-tellers were hounded relentlessly unless they registered with the local government, at which point they became official liars instead of illegal ones. Next, we have the crime that proves Victorians truly feared chaos: harmful kite-flying. Flying a kite was not inherently illegal, but if the kite caused alarm, disrupted horse traffic, tangled telegraph wires, or, most Victorian of all, created undue merriment, you were guilty. Children were scolded for aerial mischief. Adults were warned against loose recreational impulses. Horses reportedly panicked at the sight of fluttering paper creatures in the sky, so kite flyers became enemies of public order. But Victorian absurdity reached new heights with obstructing the pavement with an unnecessary pig. A pig in the wrong place was a traffic hazard. Authorities fined people for letting pigs loiter, wander, nap, socialise, or exhibit disorderly routing. One man was charged with public hindrance by pig, which sounds like a folk band, but was in fact a serious municipal concern. Yet perhaps the most bewildering offence was impersonating an Egyptian. Street performers, magicians, and fortune-tellers often adopted exotic personas to attract crowds. Authorities responded by criminalising such performances under anti-vagrancy laws. Anyone pretending to be foreign, especially Egyptian, Arabian, or Hindu, risked charges of deceit, misrepresentation, or attempting to pass as a mysterious wanderer. The police were very sensitive to mystery. We cannot overlook unlawfully shaking a rug, a real offence in some towns. If you shook dust, crumbs, or debris onto the street, you contaminated the public environment, earning yourself a fine. One poor woman was charged because she shook out a tablecloth and the crumbs allegedly startled a passing dog. Other gems include operating a false beard in public, theatrical street performers without permits, improper donkey racing too exciting, standing where a lamp should have been, confusing coach drivers at night, unauthorised street juggling, possibly seductive, possessing a suspiciously large carrot and cause unspecified. Victorians lived in a world where absolutely anything could become criminal if it made the wrong person nervous. The good news? These bizarre laws give us some of history's funniest court records. The bad news? Someone somewhere was once arrested for aggressively carrying bread.